Is it live yet?
We are live.
Thank you, Bob. Hello, Commissioner King. Good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. We're still waiting for two commissioners, but because this is scheduled for 1 o'clock, I think we'll just go ahead and I bet they'll be here right away. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm Mary Wall, Chair of the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission, and I'd like to call the March 17th, 2022 Commission meeting to order. I live in Langlois on the south coast of Oregon in Congressional District 4, and let's go ahead and introduce the rest of the commissioners. Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde, will you start?
Yes, good morning. I'm Becky Hatfield-Hyde, and I am in Congressional District 2.
Thank you. And Commissioner Labhart.
Good afternoon, Mark Labhart. I'm the Eastern Oregon at-large representative, and I live in Sisters.
Thank you. Commissioner Khalil.
Hi, I'm Kathy and Khalil. I live in Southwest Portland, Oregon, and I represent Western Oregon at large.
Thank you. Commissioner King.
Hello, Dr. Leslie King, Congressional District 3, which includes Portland, and I live in Portland.
Thank you. And we'll have Commissioners Spellbrink and Vice Chair Zarnowitz introduce themselves when they, oh, there's Commissioner Zarnowitz. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, if you will, Vice Chair Zarnowitz.
It's Jill Zarnowitz, and I'm in the 1st District so far, and near the town of Yamhill.
Thank you. Deputy Director Colbert, will you introduce yourself as well? And thank you for covering this meeting for the director.
Good afternoon, everyone. Deputy Director Fish and Wildlife, Debbie Colbert. And I just want to note that I'm not seeing a lot of green on the screens today, so I'm assuming that everybody else was surprised by the fact that today is St. Patrick's Day. I don't know how I lost track of that.
What we have on doesn't look green to you? What? Thank you. Good, Commissioner Labhart. Michelle Tate, will you introduce yourself and mention any platform logistics that we need to know about?
Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Tate. I'm here today supporting the technical side of this meeting so that the commission and the department can hold this workshop. This is a pretty straightforward meeting. It is being streamed to YouTube for the public to watch, and I hope that everyone enjoys the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. For today's meeting, as Michelle said, it's pretty straightforward. We've already had a few fish passage issues come before us. We'll have more over the spring and fall. And so, and including a rules package this fall. Our purpose today is to have a workshop so that we can be briefed by staff on the legal context, on passage problems and solutions, importantly, on climate change context for these issues, on policy options and issues. And as you will hear, some of the solutions that we'll talk about or hear about are include the use of some of the federal money that's coming toward Oregon. So we will hear about that as well. Commissioners, if there are issues that you didn't hear in that list that you specifically want to make sure are mentioned today, go ahead and speak up or send a message. This is a 3-hour meeting. It's scheduled to be 3 hours. We'll take a break about halfway through. And I thank all of you again for being here and the department for what we're about to hear. And thank you to the public for listening to this. I know we're not having public testimony today, but we appreciate your attention and your interest in this set of passage issues. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the department. Deputy Director, did you want to introduce this or would you like to go right to Sean Clements?
I think we can hand it off to Sean to kind of maybe introduce staff and get us going.
Okay, thank you. Sean?
Thanks, Debbie and commissioners. So yeah, we got a lot of ground to cover this afternoon. This really is the year of fish passage. There's a lot going on in this program. And you've got two phenomenal folks here, and Alan Ritchie and Greg Apke, who know this stuff inside out. And they're, I think, the perfect two to kind of lay the platform for you all in understanding what authorities the Department and Commission has and how we exercise them and how we're being strategic in trying to address passage throughout the state. So we'll just dive right in, I think, with Greg.
Thank you, Sean. Just a quick sound check. Can folks hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, my name is Greg Apke. For the record, I lead our state's Fish Passes program here with ODFW. As Sean mentioned, here with me is Alan Ritchie. We're going to kind of tag team this. Appreciate the opportunity. So Commissioners, Deputy Director Colbert, we really want to take the time today and provide you all kind of a policy framework and platform to be informed on. As Chair Wall mentioned a moment or two ago, we do have a couple salient fish passage issues coming forward, two of which are going to be, I believe, entertaining tomorrow, and then later this fall, a fish passage rule revision initiative that we want to unveil, and we'll speak to briefly here today. So my responsibility with Oregon Fish and Wildlife is to administer our fish passage rules and statutes. Pretty simple, a pretty narrow portfolio of responsibilities, but it's complicated at times, and we really want to take the time today, maybe look back a little bit to provide you that policy framework, really answer any questions you all may have as commissioners. And hopefully at the end of the day, you'll be much more informed and maybe have a whole new suite of questions you may want to ask us. But I'm really excited to be here. I'm real passionate about fish passage. I've been in this position a long time and really eager and excited to get going. So here we go. Can folks see my screen okay? Awesome. So we have about 40 slides, so I apologize in advance. Some of these are going to be quick, easy pictures. Some of these have a lot of details, but we really want to just walk through this, take the time and answer any questions you may have. Primary purpose of this, again, is to frame this up so we all are informed on commission about actions coming forward, your authority. We want to walk you through and define some key terms that's directly related to our fish passes authority. We want to talk a little bit about the intersection of climate change and passage barriers, certainly establish a policy perspective and history for you all. We'll talk a bit about passage statutes and rules. We're going to focus in on some specific sections, fish passage triggers, what that means, waivers and exemptions, and I think importantly, Commission's authority as it relates to those actions. We'll talk briefly about our Fish Passes Task Force, their role, their responsibility to inform Commission on decisions. We will unveil our rule revision initiative, and Alan Ritchie, our program manager for screening and passage, will kind of close us out on questions and talk specifically about funding opportunities, partnerships, and the ever important need to prioritize our efforts. So let's just kind of set the stage here for what really, what is a fish passes barrier and how it's defined. This language is from statute. So this is defined in our statutes, ORS 509-580. And a fish passes barrier, simply stated as any man-made dam, diversion, or other device placed in waters of the state that preclude or prevent the migration of native migratory fish. This definition and these statutory, this law and our rules apply to 32 different species of native migratory fish. Absolutely includes the salmon, the iconic salmon here in the Pacific Northwest, but also reaches down deep into some of those maybe non-glamorous fish, pike minnow, some of our estuarine fish that do need to migrate, Lampetra species, and some of our catastomids, certainly sturgeon, whitefish, and many others. So this is not just about salmon and salmon passage. Thought I would just speak briefly and kind of outline some of the, from a fish's perspective, what types of physical structures in waters that you as a fish are trying to navigate both up and downstream might encounter, and what that means for you as a fish. And all of these are very apparent. Things like excessive water velocities, jump heights, physical structures, levees, dams, diversions, tide gates, a ton of other issues. I think it's important to note here that our rules really apply and compel department to look at a project site once there is a trigger event, and we'll get into that in a few slides. Look at the species composition at that site that were present today and present historically at that site, and figure out which of those species are going to be impacted or are being impacted at the site, and really boils down to defining the weakest swimming life history of a particular species at a site, and then developing rules around attaining or accomplishing passage for those weaker swimming fish. Important kind of a underpinning theme to not overlook. We really design to our weaker swimming fish, often juvenile life histories, but jump heights, velocities, physical structures impairing up and downstream passage. These things contribute absolutely to water quality, low stream flows, false attraction at fishways, etc. There's many other, but these are some of the more important challenges you might experience if you're a native fish moving upstream as an adult or even downstream as a juvenile in your quest for the ocean. Just a couple pictures to kind of bring this home. Classic dam, Deschutes River. You've seen them, they're everywhere. Water diversions, particularly servicing landowners and water rights, municipalities. This in kind of the background is a large push-up dam in the valley, Coast Fork of the Willamette River. And these go in intermittently, seasonally, to attain legitimate legal water rights. The lower right hand is a much smaller scale. What you might recognize in the lower left hand is a channel kind of spanning rock push-up aggregate visqueen structure to, during the irrigation season, realize a legal water right. Culverts, by and large, are probably our most frequent and problem child here, if I may. The infrastructure, the built infrastructure that we all travel on, we take maybe advantage of at times. There are thousands of culverts underneath our roadways, a lot of which are in very poor or degraded condition. Tide gates, floodgates for those on the estuarine salty dog side of the house. Tide gates are attributed to municipalities, private landowners, ag, non-ag, transportation owners, really to prevent and preclude wind and wave surge, high water during winter times, even saline intrusion onto ag pastures. So tide gates along the coast are quite problematic if you're a native fish trying to move up and downstream. By boiling this down a little bit to, what are the true impacts, biological impacts or mechanisms driven by fish passes or fish passage barriers, or the lack of access of habitat through impediments, physical impediments. Mechanisms are pretty simple to understand. Certainly, if you impair passage of a fish up or downstream, you're diminishing their production potential. You're diminishing their carrying capacity to produce and rear and forage. There is often genetic isolation both within populations and across broader populations when habitat access is disconnected. Often is the case where you do have direct mortality and indirect stressors. But most important here is the loss of physical habitat and your ability as a fish to access that habitat in the reduction of habitat connectivity absolutely decreases fish population productivity and resiliency. Just a quick slide or two here, really kind of boiling this down to the physical mortality and injury side of the house. These are real pictures. Culverts, fish ladders, exclusion devices on undersized culverts, fishways. The issue is real. Kind of framing up in Chairwall, we wanted to frame up some of your questions in commissioners and translate them into some slides and speak to them directly. So one of the questions that I believe came up was, where are these barriers located? What's the frequency? What's the scope of the problem? And we put this slide in really to do that, not to give you too much of a fear factor, but this is a daunting challenge. This slide on the left represents ODFW data from 2019 and really portrays the black dots in excess of 30,000 fish passage barriers known presently, man-made physical structures that impair bidirectional fish passage. The red dots are the highest priority barriers that the state is aware of and knows about that were prioritized in 2019. The commission approved this priority list. So that's just a quick snapshot in time of the scope of the problem and where those priority barriers are. It's important to know that not all fish passage barriers are equal or equivalent. Some of these black dots, while very overwhelming, maybe to the layperson and certainly me, in terms of the frequency and scope, some of these are not complete barriers. Some of these are seasonal barriers and may only impair certain times of the year, certain life histories. Some of these black dots absolutely impair 100% upstream physical habitat access to a variety of native species. I think the importance here is just to reflect the scope of the problem. Each of these dots may impact hundreds of feet. Some of these dots may impact miles and miles, and in some cases, hundreds of miles of habitat upstream of the impediment. And I think the take home for this slide really is it brings full circle the fact that we've got to be strategic, efficient, and really have to focus particularly our restoration dollars on high priority locations. Translate that prioritization theme into a couple slides. Lower left is a common culvert. This, in fact, in the Willamette Valley, I believe under I-5, owned and managed by the Department of Transportation. This is a seasonal waterway. Waters up in the fall and provides habitat for rearing cutthroat trout and only cutthroat trout. So the seasonality and the importance of habitat access is real, but certainly maybe not to the same degree the broader picture in the background, which is one of the state's highest priorities fixed a 3 years ago on the Crooked River. This is the Opal Springs fish ladder on the Opal in the Deschutes Basin. A multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art vertical slot fish ladder. I don't know if you're going to be able to see, let me pull up my laser pointer. This is a complicated site. I won't spend much time on it, but to the left or the right of the screen is a channel spanning irrigation diversion dam managed by, I believe, the Deschutes Valley Irrigation District for energy production and water distribution. This fishway, the fish ladder entrance is, there's actually 2 different entrances here submerged. So fish aren't swimming up this overflow bypass channel. This was designed to really promote downstream passage of ocean migrating anadromous fish as well as resident fish. So this is a super high priority, which again, the theme of the slide here is we've got to be quite strategic on how and when and where we spend our dollars. Just some simple metrics. We know, again, the road transportation network and infrastructure has tens of thousands of culverts underneath the traveling roadway, a lot of which are imperiled and in really poor condition, owned and managed across many ownerships, particularly the DOTs and the public ownerships within the counties and local jurisdictions. We have in excess of 1,000 dams on waters of the state, approximately 1,200 tide gates on the coast, and many, many other dikes and diversions and levees that aren't necessarily reflected in these metrics. But the take home here again is, from a historical perspective, passage over time has absolutely bisected both upstream and downstream migration of our native fish species in Oregon.
Greg, could I ask you just one question before you leave that?
Yes, ma'am, Chair Wall. Let me back up.
Is that number going, are these numbers plateauing at all, or are we still in the producing these things mode?
We absolutely are making tremendous inroads, Chair Wall, on the progress of these barriers, the restoration actions, the repairs over time, the last 2 decades. So I'd like to say we're making progress, and we're going to speak to that a little bit. So okay. Yes, there's the short answer.
Okay, thank you.
Broad answer would be we do not have necessarily a comprehensive inventory of every barrier in the state. So they do pop up at times. I was on a meeting 2 weeks ago where we came upon a new landowner that allowed us permission onto their property. And guess what? We come to find 2 new partial barriers on their property. So while we're diminishing these numbers over time, there are still some that are out there that we don't necessarily know about.
Thank you.
Chair Wall, just to add on to what Greg's saying there. So we're certainly finding barriers that are pre-existing. When new barriers are being constructed, there's a requirement to provide passage of those. So you're not putting in the same problems that we're dealing with historically there. And then, as Greg said, we're ticking off the pre-existing ones through voluntary and trigger work. And you'll get to that later. So I think that overall, the scope of the problem is going downwards.
I will do that specifically here in a few slides, Chair Wall. And thank you for the question. If there are other questions, we're happy to entertain those and take the time before you forget them. This intersection of the state's climate policy, the in situ climate changing conditions that are real and out there on the landscape, do in fact intersect fish passage. What we know is the aquatic environment that these species really need to thrive and be successful and sustainable and viable. A common tenet of that success is being able to access habitat, whether it's for breeding, spawning, foraging, rearing, escaping predation. Important, absolutely. And what we know is the trends in our aquatic ecosystems are, in some basins, going to see increasing water temperatures, decreasing stream flows, and many other stressors like fires that we've seen the last few years, which really parlays forward to the ability of these species to be able to move freely, to access habitat, which is, again, super important for their continued existence. We've got to be sensitive and focused and smart on our restoration efforts and our limited resources to target those basins we know are going to be resilient over the long haul for these aquatic species. An example of what I just said is a project completed but just a few months ago. For those down in the Rogue Valley Basin, this is on Slate Creek, which is a tributary of the Applegate River, a tributary to the main stem Rogue River. Harbolt Dam in Slate Creek is absolutely a cool water refuge for a lot of native species, including steelhead, coho, chinook, lamprey, and others. This dam on the left side was removed this past fall through a lot of cooperation and partnerships with the department, some of our funding, and local partnerships with the landowner and others, working collaboratively to develop a funding package and then an implementation strategy. And this dam was permanently removed this last summer and was one of our higher priority barriers in the Applegate Basin. For the sake of trying to put this into some physical reference, the old dam, if you can see my arrow on the slide, existed right in this general area. I want to transition. So any questions maybe on me kind of setting the table here a bit? I'll pause if there's any questions on what I've covered, kind of framing up the scope. What I want to get into next is really getting into the policy framework, what this means, your authority. And I see a hand up. Commissioner King.
Yes, hi, thank you. A question, I don't know if we'll cover it in this or any of the talks, but I kind of have more of a general question, and I think it relates more to funding. Like, for example, I'm familiar, not in all of the details, but I'm familiar that, say, WashDOT is contributing significantly more money to culvert repair and things like that. And I don't understand why they're so different than what we are, that as we discussed it in our last commission meeting. So are we going to discuss any of that and determine, are we ever going to at least become more equivalent to what they're doing or not, and why?
I'm not necessarily prepared to get into the weeds on that. We certainly can. We aren't necessarily going to go there in this presentation, but we can address that as best we can, and I can speak to that briefly. There are some real subtle differences and nuances between the two states. As you may know, the state was sued, Washington was sued through suit a few years ago from the tribes. And that has played itself out through the courts. And there have been, I guess as a result of that, a ton of additional funding earmarked to get at those problematic culverts, and for a lot of different reasons. So the state of Washington have had an increase in their funding subsidy as well as a legal mandate. A little different than here we are and what we have in Oregon. We have a policy framework unique and different than the state of Washington, in that our statutory authority that I will describe in a few minutes is driven by these trigger events. And we'll talk specifically about what that means, about the activities that compel and require legally the project owner operator to address passes at that point in time when they're taking on things like construction, demolition, major maintenance, replacements, etc. So I don't know if Sean, did you have a thought or a add-on to that?
Just to say that I think it's the intent during the roundtable to have a talk about, are we moving the needle, and how might we move it even more than we are currently? And there's a big part of that obviously is funding. Like, there's being strategic, and then there's the gut. So yeah.
Chair Labhart.
Thanks, Greg. So I fully realize we have a lot of work yet to do, but I also want to elaborate just a little bit on what I think is some really cool stuff that's been going on. Yesterday, I had the privilege of attending a tour with the new U.S. Fish and Wildlife Director and the Deputy Secretary of Interior. And the reason they came to Oregon was to look at some, among other things, some really successful fish passage programs that you were intimately involved in, and that's the culvert program that OWEB is funding, the identification of tide gates that are out there that are failing, and the what they call the Salmon Superhighway, which is a program that's been fairly successful, funded by Oregon Trout and others, OWEB, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the new director, Marcia Williams, was very impressed with the work that was done. We went to a project that was a fish passage barrier on Mapes Creek, which is a tributary to the Kilchis River, significant fish passage barrier there. And she was very impressed how agencies, NGOs, local government, state government, federal government have come together. And Amy Horseman from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was a big pusher of that, and talked about how working together you can get a lot of these projects done with permitting and funding and those kind of things. So she was pretty impressed. So I wanted to make sure that give a little shout out to the department and to the other agencies that she came to Oregon to see some good work that's being done.
Thanks, Chair Labhart. We have, while don't get me wrong, I didn't want to paint too much of a negative story with that slide of the scope, but that's real. We have made tremendous inroads the last 20 years and nothing but the sky is the limit here in terms of opportunities. And we have developed what I believe are just awesome relationships across the state. And we have a lot of great accomplishments that we can share. So that's important, absolutely. Any other questions before we transition a bit into really the policy framework? Thank you. So our statutory authority that you all have, we provided you, I believe, a set of the statutes and the administrative rules that accommodate the statutes. The policy is front and center, right up front in definition. It's the state's policy to provide up and downstream passage for all native migratory fish species that I identified a previous few slides, and where those fish are presently or were historically present. This was adopted by our legislature in 2001, and we'll speak a little bit to the history here. Another unique attribute, I guess, of the state is prior to statehood in 1848, the Oregon Territorial Constitution recognized the importance of fish passage. And when the state became a state, that constitutional language carried forward into our state constitution. So we had a passage policy, if I may, on the books prior to statehood, 1859. In the 1980s, and I'm going to kind of breeze through this because there's a long, protracted history here. There were a variety of legislation, certainly back before our time, that was developed and memorialized that really made the requirements a little more ambiguous, maybe a little less clear and less undefinable in the 1890s, I apologize. In the mid-1900s, there was absolutely a lack of enforcement, strict enforcement, and a lot of deals made along the landscape. Snapping forward to kind of the plight of the coastal coho salmon, salmon and fish passage and habitat access was identified as a real limiting factor. And in the vein of trying to help keep ahead of the declining populations of coastal coho, the department and the legislative authorities came to terms that fish passage has got to be kind of dusted off, bought off the shelf, looked at, and evaluated. And in 1996, council drafted a letter to the commission basically requiring that the consolidation of those previous laws over time did not necessarily grant the department authority to waive fish passage or forego fish passage. And it's that very reason there's a lot of barriers on the landscape that don't have or never did address fish passage. And it was that memorandum in the collaboration with the legislature and the department and the commission that it was realized it's time to dust off the statutes, snap them forward to a present time, recognize the scope of the problem, and really develop a new law that gave flexibility, allowed discretion, provided opportunities for fish passage waivers, and we'll describe what that is in a few moments. Most importantly, to convene a task force across numerous stakeholders to come to the table and figure out this fish passage dilemma and translate this into a new statute that the Department of Fish and Wildlife could administer clearly, effectively over time. And in 2001, the 71st legislature did in fact memorialize through a variety of House bills, House Bill 3002, House Bill 2102, the new statutes that were memorialized, I believe, in August of 2021. And then a few years after, the department established our first fish passage administrative rule that the commission adopted in 2006. So boiling this down, there's a long history here, and we have a lot of legacy projects that haven't necessarily provided passage, and this is one of the reasons over the course of time, broad interpretation, providing waivers where the authority wasn't there. So that's kind of where we're at today. Any questions on that legislative history? There is, in fact, and we have on our website, and we can provide that, a document that walks through the task force, their process, how they came to terms with the new statutory recommendations. That's a really important and thoughtful read if you ever have the time.
I have a quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, I think I can kind of piece it together, but can you enumerate who the major stakeholders are for some of those task groups, et cetera?
I absolutely can. It's about 30 constituents.
Or like generally?
The governor's office, the Oregon Association of Counties, special water districts, the Water Resources Department, the ag industry, water suppliers, water users, environmental organizations, including the angling and harvesting community, hydroelectric stakeholder groups, and others. And that's all captured in the report I mentioned a few moments ago, the report to the 71st Legislative Assembly. So that Commissioner Khalil kind of gives you an idea of all the stakeholders. There was a lot of thought given to who needs to be at the table. And really each and every stakeholder was invited to the table and participated for the course of the better part of a year in developing the statutory framework that was adopted in 2001.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. From the statutes in 2001 are these various authorities that are paramount to the implementation of the rules and the regulations. One of the more important ones here, short of reading all these, is it gave the Department of Fish and Wildlife full authority to administer fish passage at trigger sites, which we're going to get into next. Provided clarity on passage rules and regulations and inventory, fish passage waivers, kind of had a mandate to develop rules and exemptions. Gave the department and commission authorities that we're going to speak about as well, including enforcement authorities. And these are really just the section headers in statutes that you all have. Drilling down a little bit are some of the nuanced mandates embedded within the statutes. We've talked a bit and we're going to talk more about prioritization efforts, but within our statutory framework is a requirement for the department every 5 years to establish through commission and your approval a statewide fish passage priority barrier list. We did that in 2013, 2019, and again, moving into doing this again the next few years for something to be put in front of you all in 2024. The authority for the department to approve all fish passage plans. That's really a large part of my responsibility and what we do here out of our headquarters office. One of the underpinning tenets of our statute authority is this cooperation partnership tenet. Recognizing overnight you are not going to fix the 40,000+ bears. That's going to take a lot of financial resources and it's going to take time. And within the statute framework was established this trigger approach. And we'll talk what that means for the owners, operators, and the department. And then this establishment of the task force, another mandate that they have a pretty critical role in advising the department on all things fish passage. Again, just trying to highlight some of these mandates that you may or may not be aware of. For the sake of just walking through the portfolio of administrative rules that are in place currently, with the exception of the very first bullet, and I'll speak to this in a few moments about what we're doing on revising our administrative rules. But these are the primary sections in the rule that we administer across the board. We're going to talk specifically about the waiver and exemption rules and a few others here shortly.
Hey, Greg, just something to add here. So Greg kind of touched on some of the founding statutes and then we're going to rule here. I think it's important to keep in mind that whereas several of our statutes are rather vague in what they require, fish passage statutes are actually fairly prescriptive and provide a really narrow kind of view of the world for the department to craft rule around. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about fish passage statutes versus, say, the food fish policy or the wildlife policy.
Sean, if I could just to follow up on that one a little bit, you and Greg have both been talking about the history of the legislation so far and the statute as it's played out. Have there been efforts by the department and a group of stakeholders to beef up some of these statutes and get ahead of the game that way a little bit, or is that something that might still be to come?
I think I don't have the full legislative history here, but at least what I've observed there's been the opposite. There's been several attempts to pass legislation that weakens these statutes, and some of them have been successful. We don't need to do it today, but I'm curious if we're going to get to some of those gaps that you'll just mention in prevent the gaps in the statute. I do know there have been some weakenings and that sort of thing, but are there gaps that we've been trying to close or fill or alter over the last 5 or so years? Yeah, I think that's something to cover in the round table, like how are we moving the needle and what do we need to do differently perhaps?
Thank you.
Well, I would add just briefly, through the Rural Revision Initiative that I'll describe here in a few moments, we've been at this now a little bit, almost a full year, and we absolutely have taken a deep dive, and we recognize where our statutes might need some very surgical, prescriptive, thoughtful change to allow for maybe more flexibility. I am unaware, and I've been at this since 2007, 2008, of any real things that you specifically mentioned, but we definitely in our rules have identified areas that we believe, to strengthen the rule, to give more clarity to the public, more certainty to the public, and certainly err when appropriate on the side of the fish. And we will get to that more on the roundtable. It's a great. You're welcome. So the next slide is really snapping forward to, okay, what's this mean for the landowner? If I'm a owner operator of a fish passage impediment, let's say a road culvert or a diversion dam or a tide gate, what's this mean for me? When do I have to demonstrate compliance with the statute, again, which is to provide passage? And the legislation gave a lot of thought to trying this phased in approach, if I may. It was just absolutely untenable to expect overnight that every landowner is going to be able to have the resources and complete all these barriers over time. So they came out of the House bill process with a model that describes trigger events, that clearly defines activities when the owner operator is investing resources at an existing obstruction, that then clearly defines the time when the owner operator is responsible to address fish passes at that site. And we call these trigger events. So the first bullet, and we're going to get more into the weeds on the very first bullet. The second bullet here is in lieu of or without a trigger event, there are opportunities when the commission can require passage, and we'll get into that a little bit as well. But the commission can condemn passage at a site and prescribe a solution when there is an emergency, meaning a population emergency at a native fish population scale, or if there is a statewide priority and there is a 60% cost share on the state side, that is short of trigger events when commission can require passage be addressed. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. But I want to speak a little bit more to these trigger events. These are clearly defined in administrative rule and spoken to certainly in statute, but new construction, placing man-made structures across waters or in waters of the state where you have native fish, that's the time to address fish passage. Major replacement of an existing barrier, that's the time the law requires that the owner operator address fish passage. Activities that modify water diversion, storage, or diversion capacity, at a physical structure in waters of the state, that's the time when construction invokes the authority of the department to require passage. And then installation of road and stream crossings, predominantly roads, culverts, bridges, etc. The other two primary triggers defined in statute is the fundamental change in permit status. There's a definition of that, basically when there is a change in regulatory authority for the operation of an artificial obstruction, a barrier, where the regulatory agency that has that authority has discretion to impose additional conditions on the applicant. This translates to things like new water rights, relicensing of water rights, additional storage capacity associated with water rights, etc. And then finally, abandonment of an obstruction. If a structure is abandoned and arcaned and not going to be used and left in place, the intent is that's the time to make the investment for fish passage and address passage prior to the abandonment. So once there is a trigger event, and this is all really about project development, scoping, knowing as an owner operator, I've got to replace a culvert, and knowing how this action as an owner operator may intersect the state's fish passage authority. What are the options once there is a trigger event? What do I as an owner have to do now? One, we can provide passage through a lot of different varieties, removing the impediment, designing and constructing a fish passage compliant structure, i.e. maybe a culvert, designing and installing a fishway around or over the impediment. So that's kind of option one. You provide and address passage at the location. And then there are two other options we're going to get into specifically: applying for a fish passage waiver or a fish passage exemption. So those are really the options you have as you go to repair, replace, construct, abandon existing facilities or new facilities. It's important to note that you have to address passage prior to the trigger event, which is all about planning and coordination with the department, and that the owner operator is responsible for addressing fish passage. Any questions on this slide? Jill?
I think Becky was first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Commissioner Hyde.
Commissioner Hyde?
She's waving at me. Okay. Yeah, how would a person, just say a farmer that has a few hundred acres or something and has their own road, and they need to replace the culvert, and there are the fish triggers there, how would they know to approach the department or that they had to meet this requirement?
It's a great question, and often is the case where our landowners are uninformed and don't frankly know and haven't planned for the action, and that's where we are challenged at times. The department has made tremendous investments to educate the public, getting out, working with the stakeholders, the constituents across the state. I've been doing that for almost 20 years. We feel it's absolutely critical to inform the applicants, to inform the owner operators. I say that in that, you do your very best to inform the public, and you can't get everywhere all the time. I think we've got a fairly interactive and effective, efficient website. Our district fish biologists across the state, this is often discussions in roundtables over coffee, planning meetings. We do our very best to inform the public. And that really is critical, and that the public understand that this statute is in place. And most important, start to plan for the action. All these facilities like culverts have a pretty short lifespan, 30, 40 years, even less on the coast. And like any other structure, you have to own and maintain, and you've got to know what that means. So we do, I think, a comprehensive job as best we can to educate the public. A lot of it is through the watershed councils as well, kind of extensions of our staff. But I don't want to paint too much of a rosy picture. That's often a need and takes a lot of commitment and time to educate the public.
So are soil and water conservation districts well aware of this too, so that they can?
I say yes, but there in the past decade have been a lot of staffing turnover within our agency as well. It's something that we have to continually be on the ground and emphasize and speak to through, roundtables, public meetings, district fish out interacting with landowners, talking about restoration opportunities. So it's an ongoing need, absolutely. But I do think most of the stakeholders in our CS, SWCDs, the watershed councils and others are very informed, and most often is the case that landowners are aware of this.
Okay, thank you.
The other point where they become aware, and I'm sorry, this is the Alan Ritchie, but the other point where they become aware is certainly a lot of folks know about the need for fill removal permits and reaching out to DSL for a permit, or does this not need a permit? And certainly DSL is well aware and refers folks to our fish passage program when there's a potential trigger at a site, whether it requires a DSL permit or not. It is an additional notification, but as Greg said, not everyone may always know.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hyde.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. There is the process that you guys are going through every 5 years or whatever it was to from the state to prioritize like where the most important places are in the, I gotta move you guys in my screen. So that's its own process. That's where ODF&W says, if we look at everywhere in the state of Oregon, what we're going to say is that Opal Springs is a top priority because we've gotten to that point in that system where that's a priority. So we're not going to prioritize some random fish passage somewhere where it's not necessary. We're really going to focus up on the limited dollars we have. And so that's one thing that's going on. And then there's this other thing that's going on, which is if anybody, is an owner operator of an individual diversion that's already there. So it's two different things, right?
Commissioner Hyde, that's fair. I think there's a third leg to the stool that you overlooked. So you characterize the priority list as a silo, if I may, that gets at implementation. The trigger silo where owner operators are required legally to address passes. The third leg of the stool in my mind is all the restoration actions that are happening across the landscape, short of a fish passage trigger event, and even short of being on the statewide priority list. Go ahead.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, can I ask, and then I have one more question on this, which is when you use the term owner operator, the owner operator could be the city of Salem, it could be, we're trying to provide passage again through Portland. It's not all, it's anybody that is got it's ODOT, obviously. It's a whole lot. It's everyone, right?
Chair Hyde, commissioners, it is absolutely everyone. Private, public, municipalities, state and federal agencies. There really are no, if I may, exemptions from your responsibility to achieve this state policy.
Okay, thank you so much.
Operator, you're welcome. Commissioner Spellbrink.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Chair Wall, Greg, I'm guessing that probably our awareness of some of these fish passage problems comes from just, someone driving by, seeing something, reporting, that kind of thing too. In fact, I've had here local east of Salem here, there's a few little creeks run out here. I've had people call me and say, hey, somebody just built a pond here and they build it right and put a dam on a creek here that's, they pretty much all have cutthroat trout in them. So if every one of those, as far as reporting, I mean, if someone calls and asks, just should they like call the district biologist first, or where should you point them?
Chair Spellbrink and commissioners, absolutely. Our district staff are in the district for that very purpose, to service their stakeholders within their watershed districts. And they are really on point. And that's not, we do hear frequently of those types of scenarios that you described, and our district staff would meet on site, preferably with the landowner where we have access, talk about and educate about the state law, and really try to grow some trust and work towards a viable solution. And that often takes time. It's not something that often is going to be done overnight. There is, in some cases, a punitive or enforcement avenue for those types of outcomes, whether it's a fill removal or even fish passage violation. Those circumstances do arise, and yes, our district staff are on point.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And Chair Wall, is it my job to, I keep maybe just asking commissioners when they have hands up, do you want to facilitate that, or should I just continue in that vein?
It's quicker if you just keep doing it, and if anybody, I'll jump in. Go ahead, Greg.
Sorry, I apologize.
Working well. Nope.
Commissioner King.
Thank you, Greg and Chair Wall. It's a follow-on to Commissioner Spellbrink, what he brought up, his kind of concern question when things are brought to him. I hear kind of anecdotally a lot of the same thing, that someone is a private landowner, big or small, that's just kind of gone off and done their own thing, whether it's a dam, whatever it is. Like, what is there something punitive? Like, okay, so you sit and you have a meeting about it. Are they fined? Are they forced to remove it? Does something happen? It's particularly if somebody's got a lot of money, they can just kind of do what they want, no matter what you're saying, is kind of what I'm gathering so far. So is there more to it than that?
Great question, Commissioner King. Every example of this is unique. I think it's important that once we become aware of these types of actions on the landscape, to get on the ground, meet the landowner, and have a discussion. Were they aware? Were they not? Do they understand? Do they not? What was the purpose and intent of their action? And that's where the discussion starts. And how those site-specific issues are resolved are unique to the landowner, unique to the circumstance. Some actions may or may not have other authorities at the table, like Division of State Lands, the Corps of Engineers with fill removal, NOAA Fisheries within projects under their domain. We tend to find the public generally fairly cooperative, particularly when they understand maybe the tenor or the nature or the issues or the risks once that's identified to them. So we have a lot of good cooperation. There are examples where we haven't had maybe the same level of good cooperation. And there's kind of a process we work through: issuance of letters, meeting with the agencies, kind of putting the landowner on notice and working with them in a time frame, giving them some time to plan, design, and fund solutions. And then there is that aggregate where the action is in a true enforcement avenue, often led through state lands or the Corps through their permitting authorities. Most often is the case when it's a fish passage issue. As you described, Commissioner King, there's often fill and removal associated with the placement of that structure, whether it's a culvert that was not authorized, a diversion dam, or something along those lines.
So Commissioner King, I might chime in here on maybe just a direct real life example that captures a couple of the questions that come up about, do we know where they're all at? What are the options when we discover them? Not long after we completed it, after you approved the last 2009 fish passage priority list, we got wind of a new barrier in Oregon. It's down in the Umpqua. Got wind of a new barrier. There was some complaints issued by neighbors. This is the exact scenario that's come up here. Our district went out there, and for starters, ODFW wasn't aware of it. It was a brand new barrier that wasn't on our radar. It wasn't on our priority list, wasn't on our inventory. In discussion with the district, it certainly would have been on the priority, knowing where it's at and the impacts. But it was a brand new barrier that we documented. And then it was also an unscreened diversion. And we had documented fish loss in the ditch. So we had the kind of the triple whammy here. And we were able to assess some of the ditch. When I say we are, our district staff, I think of us as one big family here, but our district staff was able to document mortalities associated with this brand new barrier. It wasn't a brand new barrier, but it was new to us. It was certainly an old existing barrier. Unscreened diversion. We worked with them to try and get this corrected. I would say we initially weren't getting a huge amount of success in working with them. So, we do have damages that we can cite in statutes of what each body by listing status is worth. And we sent them a letter identifying, based on just the mortalities that our staff observed and recovered down there, this is what you can be assessed. We need to eliminate this from the future. Let's work together to get this in place. And that's starting to move forward. We didn't have time to work with them on a criteria screen in time for the water season, but we did fashion a loaner screen that we worked with them to get installed, and working with them on, addressing the entire project. So we were able to, cite an actual financial penalty based on the damages there. In that case, we actually had, mortality to point to and actually count bodies because of the unscreened diversion. It's often more difficult with a barrier. Greg showed some pictures earlier where you could count some dead fish that were due to a barrier, but it's hard to count bodies if there's just a delay or a fish are not able to get up. So that is an additional challenge, but we do have some resources that we use when the time is right.
So I guess you're saying people are fined. And then, is there something that you can force them to take it down? Or again, if this is someone that's wealthy and they don't care about the fine and they do it anyway, that's kind of what I'm getting at. It's like, how much teeth, how much strength does this have? I can just see so many ways around this. And then you're talking about private property. What if they never let you on property? So you can't even see it. So you only see it on a flyover, so, it just seems flimsy. If you have a lot of money, I guess what I'm saying.
Commissioner King, I might add just a little bit more on to what Alan said. We do have our Oregon Plan Fish and Wildlife Troopers, Oregon State Police, that effectively implement and enforce these statutes and rules. So there are times and situations and places where an OSP officer needs to be brought in with a site visit. If a trespass issue, like you just described, we can't get on the property, then that's where our partners at OSP can help facilitate that discussion with a landowner, facilitate the gravity of the situation and the legal risks, and also help to facilitate solutions.
And Commissioner King, just to add on to that, I think this is not really different from any law that's on the books. There's a large proportion of people will follow the law. There are some people that are unaware of the law, and when you talk to them, you can find a solution. And there's some bad actors out there. And we do have some tools, and we do exercise them judiciously for those kinds of bad actors. And we have varying levels of success in getting a positive outcome there. So I'd say overall, the system is working pretty well, but for sure there's cases where it doesn't, but that's no different from anything else. I think in the scheme of things, what we're achieving is a pretty significant for fish, I think.
Thank you. Let's, just in the interest of time, these are great discussions. Let's do one more question from Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde and then go back to Greg's presentation.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here real quick and say that I really appreciated Greg bringing up the point that the other time that this gets addressed is when there's restoration projects going on. And, I didn't really even think about that. I was thinking in the narrow scope. And I guess that's one of the things that I want to throw out here is that certainly there are egregious people all over, right? For different reasons. I guess all over is a little dramatic. But, I've been around so many restoration projects for over 25 years on private land. happening by so many different landowners, rich, poor, otherwise, that I like that, that what you said, but in the context of larger restoration that needs to go on, often these sort of issues are also addressed. So thank you for that.
You're welcome, Chair Hyde and Commissioners. One last thought on that is, when there is a restoration action that's planned, whether it's funded through the Watershed Council, OWEB, or others, those projects too come through our program for review and approval of those plans. So the framework within the statute and rules is ODFW is going to have an opportunity to weigh in on all those, whether they're restoration, whether they're enforcement, whether it's a trigger, whether it's a voluntary action. We own a piece of that through reviewing those plans and issuing a Fish Passes plan authorization or approval. So moving forward, let me change the slide here. I want to make a clear distinction. So prior to this trigger event, assuming you have a landowner that knows the process and knows their options and knows that they have to comply with Fish Passes rules and regulations prior to doing the action, the statutes in 2001 do afford landowners options. And it really is the landowner's decision at the end of the day to make a decision how they want to move forward. They, as a landowner, can provide Fish Passage. They can also seek these maybe non-Fish Passage two alternatives I'm going to outline and spend a few minutes on. So, and this is a little bit in advance of tomorrow's agenda. You're going to see a Fish Passes waiver request, Indian Creek in particular, in front of you. And I think it's important that we understand your authority within Fish Passes waivers, what this means to fish, and really trying to draw a distinction between waivers and exemptions. So again, these are non-fish passable solutions that are affordable and legally viable solutions at any given site when there is a trigger event. And these are the exemption and waiver bin. A Fish Passes waiver is appropriate when someone chooses not to provide passage at a culvert, for example, for whatever reason, whether that's economic or they just can't for whatever reason. They can go down the waiver option. They would apply to the department. And waivers are a viable plan forward when there are beneficial effects at a site if passes were provided. And that's a real important distinction between exemptions and waivers. Exemptions, there is no benefit if a landowner invests in Fish Passes at a given site. Therefore, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to spend a lot of money on a fish-friendly facility if there's no benefits for fish to access habitat. So the waiver side on the left-hand screen does require mitigation be provided by the project proponent, the owner. And there is a lot of process we can talk about, of which you'll drill in tomorrow with the Indian Creek ODOT waiver. Waivers are so good or valid so long as the next trigger event, the next time the owner has to do something at that site, and or until their mitigation strategy continues to function or doesn't function. And then on the other side of the screen here is the exemption opportunity. Again, where there is no benefits if passes were provided. These, rightly so, do not require mitigation. These are revocable. And we look at these on a recurrent interval. Every 7 years, we can revoke an exemption if authorized, if conditions change for which that exemption was authorized. An example of that might be a culvert that has many other culverts downstream. The landowner wants an exemption and there really is no habitat above this culvert, or fish can't even get to the culvert because of the downstream impediments. We then could issue that exemption at that new culvert. And if over time culverts below the exempt location become passable, then we could grant or we could revoke that exemption granted at that particular culvert. Again, just a summary, but I think the important piece here is what is commission authority as it relates to waivers and exemptions. Again, by statute, 509, 585, 7A, The commission shall approve a waiver request if the fish passes alternatives, i.e. mitigation, provide a benefit greater than had passes been provided at the location. Talk about that in a few moments. It's important to understand that. So when we do see fish passes applications, folks seeking fish passes waivers, we often meet with a landowner, gain perspective, walk them through their options, particularly for mitigation or compensation. And these 4 bullets outline those mitigation actions in statute and rule where an applicant can seek in lieu of providing passage a mitigation strategy. They can provide passage at another known barrier. They can restore habitat for native fish. They can do other actions that might in fact increase naturally produced native migratory fish. And there are other actions as defined in statute that can be approved by the commission. But paramount to this decision is there has to be this realized benefit on the ground through a mitigation action or strategy where there is a benefit greater than had passes been provided at the original trigger location. Simply stated, it's, if I may, a 1+ model.
Greg, a quick question here. In the toxics world, the state law looks at cumulative impacts. Do we do that in this case, or is it we look at the isolated incident that's just in front of us right now?
Chairwall, commissioners, we are compelled within our rules to evaluate an action at the time of the action. So we are really to consider conditions on the ground, at the site, on the landscape, at the time of the trigger event. And I don't know if that gets at your question specifically, but what we typically look at is if a waiver proposal comes forward, we look, we have to kind of determine a baseline condition, how much habitat exists above the culvert, what are the species that are at that site, how productive, what's the quality of that habitat above the culvert, and that therein sets kind of the benchmark that determines the baseline conditions from which a mitigation strategy has to overcome through a beneficial effect. So it doesn't necessarily look back in time cumulatively at maybe legacy effects at a longstanding dam, but looks forward, if I may, at the time of the action and the species that are present there today and the quality and quantity of habitat affected by that barrier. It can be downstream effects and upstream effects.
And Greg, just to add to that, I think Greg touched on it earlier, but the legislature envisioned kind of a phased approach. So as there's triggers on each of these barriers, we consider which pathway or the landowner actually applies, and we generally try and direct them in a pathway that's most beneficial for fish. But over time, I think the legislature envisioned that you would gradually work up the systems from the bottom to the top and achieve passage throughout. And we have seen that in several basins where you start off at the lowermost barrier, get passage, and kind of work your way up. So that's the important thing about the exemption is it's not forever. It's for 7 years, and if conditions change, you can revisit and revoke it.
Thank you. Looks like we have a question from Commissioner Labhart.
Yeah, this might be a sidebar conversation, but I think it relates. And so it's a little bit of history here, and I'm not sure I know the total reason. So that's why I was wondering, the Klamath situation where the dams are being removed, wasn't part of the decision for removing those dams was because of the re-licensing or reauthorization. They had to meet fish passage requirements, and because they felt that that would be too expensive, that was one of the triggers that made them decide that, nope, we're just going to take those out and restore fish passage back into that river system. Is that part of the discussion there? Help me with the history on that a little bit.
Chair Labhart, absolutely is part of that process. Keep in mind that our authority only applies to one of the 4 dams, the most upstream, J.C. Boyle. And I don't know, Sean, if you have other context you want to share, but it was in fact that licensing process that brought the state of Oregon's authority through the fundamental change in permit status trigger event that I described earlier. So yes.
Yeah, and I think that's what we've seen at several other locations around the state, that relicensing is a trigger to relook at whether passage is an issue, and typically it is fairly expensive at those types of structures. So we've seen a lot of dams being removed.
If I may, I'll
Thank you.
close on this slide just briefly in that, again, this benefit analysis, which is the Department of Fish and Wildlife's role. Once we receive an application for a waiver or an exemption, we complete boots on the ground, a benefit analysis, come to terms with the project, its proposed mitigation actions, do a benefit analysis, simply as I described earlier, weighing the mitigation strategy on top of the action as if passes were provided. And if that mitigation action or actions produces benefits greater than had passes been provided, then we come to a determination in our benefit analysis, concluding just that, and then providing a recommendation to commission, which is the last bullet here. The commission, and you'll see one tomorrow, Indian Creek ODOT fish passes waiver request, where it comes forward to commission in this case because there is greater than a mile of habitat available above that Indian Creek culvert. And there are many other waivers that you don't necessarily see, and exemptions for that matter, because of this threshold in your authority to approve. So that mile or greater than a mile, apologize, is where the commission has full authority to decide and make decisions on waivers and exemptions. Below a mile, the department has that authority by rule. I think it's important that we drill a bit deeper into what is this benefit analysis. This is defined again in statute. And I won't read from the slide here, but really what is a benefit to native fish? The mitigation action has to be in proximity, a geographic proximity to the action, has to affect the same species that were affected by the action. And again, there has to be biologically the likelihood of an increased number of native migratory fish post-treatment, if I may, after development of the mitigation actions compared to the trigger event with passage. And again, commission shall waive the requirements for fish passage if there is a benefit effect. Alternatively, and just briefly, the exemption does not require mitigation because there is no habitat above, or there would be no benefits gained if passes were provided. They're revocable. We review those routinely, and the commission has authority similar to a waiver if the habitat extent above a location that is seeking a waiver is greater than a mile. The department can refer an exemption decision to you as the commission. And if there is a formal protest, then you would absolutely be involved in reviewing and making decisions on protests. So that kind of rounds out the waiver exemption portfolio, if I may, options for landowners when there is a trigger event. We do not. Yeah, go ahead.
I didn't mean there. I was just going to, before you left that, I was just going to want to emphasize, I don't know it was fully covered how much legwork staff do on these projects before they ever get to the application point. We don't, exemptions and waivers just don't show up as an application on someone's desk one day. You know, either program staff or field staff, oftentimes, usually Greg is, you know, working with these folks up front and pointing them in the right direction and talking about what the mitigation might be, or if it's going to be, there's just no way we're going to support an exemption at this project. We need to find a mitigation if you're not going to provide fish passage. So we do a lot of work up front so that we've already kind of have a good idea of whether it's an exemption or a waiver by the time it gets to us, if it's going to kind of pencil out. We haven't done the actual analysis, and they're not predetermined, and there's certainly some outliers, and folks ultimately can apply for what they propose and we'll process it. But outside of a few outliers, I think we're pretty successful, getting them pointed in the right direction up front. And we certainly don't want to waste their time, our time, or your time on, bringing an exemption or a waiver through the process that we know in the end isn't going to be supported. And just want to make folks know these just don't show up blindly and then we bring them to you.
Commissioner Zarnowitz.
Yeah. So the agreement that we just agreed to with ODOT, I thought that was about exemptions. So that was about waivers.
No, ma'am, and I can clarify that. That is a programmatic agreement that our statutes and rules allow for some flexibility. And we worked years with ODOT to achieve just that, some flexibility. So they can, while recognizing they need to maintain their infrastructure, they can do some actions short of full compliance, if I may, with fish passage standards, while making improvements at a specific site and paying into a compensation fund that the department owns and manages, that we then turn around and translate into priority projects. So that was not a traditional waiver. That was not an exemption. That was a programmatic approach as per commission approval, kind of an other action as described by commission that afforded that outcome.
Commissioner Zarnowitz, the big key that why that's not a waiver is when fish passage is waived, they don't have to, there's no passage. They're mitigating in proximity elsewhere in lieu of fish passage. So it could become an absolute barrier and they mitigate for that. The ODOT culvert repair agreement that you folks just approved, they actually have to improve fish passage. So they are paying into a fund that we apply at priority barriers elsewhere, but they're also making an improvement in fish passage at the site that's repaired. So as Greg, that's a programmatic agreement based on some site-specific criteria.
So it's a unique hybrid that's specific to ODOT. Okay.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Vice Chair Zanowitz, that particular programmatic is with ODOT, but that doesn't rule out the possibility for others to have programmatics.
We have one more question and then because we're asking a lot of questions, we're slowing you down a bit. So let's do Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde and then get back to the slides. And at the end of about 5 more slides, we'll take a 5-minute break if we can.
Yeah, I'm so thankful that Commissioner Zarnowitz asked that question because it is very, very confusing. And I actually tried to talk to Sean about this earlier today too, trying to understand that ODOT is actually in a different situation, but that the way it works is if there was some other, the city of Salem or something wanted to put together, well, I guess that would be related to ODOT. They could do the same thing. It's really confusing, you guys. Just saying. And then one comment on the Klamath thing, Commissioner Labhart. The fish, passage rules came into play, but on a project of that scale, you've got not just ratepayers, but a tremendous amount of money from California bonds to make that happen. So I always want us to keep in mind that some of these great things that we want to do might cost more than we think. And that is certainly the case with Klamath dams. And if it hadn't been for a tremendous amount of community pressure up and down, we might have a different outcome there.
Good point. Thank you.
Chair Wall, I just have a couple more slides and then we can maybe transition and a break, and we'll close with Alan and a broader discussion and more time for questions. So let me advance the slide here. Let me talk just briefly about our Fish Passes Task Force. This is a requirement of our statute as well as a requirement of our administrative rules. We have a Fish Passes Task Force. These volunteers comprise different stakeholders. It's a 9-member public advisory council board. across 3 primary stakeholders: public at large, owners of artificial obstructions representing those stakeholders that have an invested interest, and then fishing and conservation interests. These volunteers are director appointed and can serve up to 2 4-year terms. This is a really influential and important board, if I may. We meet routinely, quarterly, and less frequent with the COVID pandemic. It's been a virtual framework the past few years, so it's been challenging, but I can't give enough shout out to these folks. They commit and volunteer their service and time. This group really is our public advisory body, and this group advises the legislature. They advise the commission on things like funding, problems, challenges, rule development, which we'll speak to in a minute. Every waiver you'll see, including the one tomorrow, or exemption that commission will see, has a public process, and part of that is our task force. And you will always see a recommendation one way or the other from our task force on these types of pending actions like the Indian Creek waiver. So this is an important advisory body that we couldn't say enough to in terms of their service, but that's their role and responsibility. And I will transition maybe to just a few more slides, and then I can take a breath, Chair Wall, and we can transition.
Okay.
I'm going to close here, if I may, if there's no questions, on our rule revision initiative that we've been in the throes of here the last 12 months. So the department recognizes with our Oregon climate and policy change policy, for that matter, the changing climate conditions on the landscape. Our fish passes rules were developed in 2006 and have not been modified or amended since then. We know our rules need to be a little more in alignment with our climate change policy. We've identified areas that we know we need to provide clarity within rule for the public. And we've been doing that aggressively the past 12 months. Our Fish Passes Task Force has been the advisory subcommittee, if I may. They have been participating in this, as has the public. And we, at this point, are starting to wrap that product up and going to be coming to you as commissioners later this fall. Through this process, and there was a question earlier maybe by Commissioner Hyde about where some of, maybe it was another commissioner, I apologize, Commissioner King, about where do we know we have some deficits? Where do we have some gaps? What do we need to do to make the rules and regulations work? And we have unearthed a few of those gaps, if I may. One of which is triggers at existing dams. And we'll speak to this a fair bit more when we come to you later this fall. But when is it appropriate to address passes at a dam? A lot of our triggers for other structures are cumulative over time, meaning if you do a maintenance repair tomorrow and another next week, while maybe below a certain threshold, but that 4th week change may in fact over into a cumulative repair that then would invoke or trigger our fish passes authority. So we're looking at a cumulative nature around the trigger event specific to dams. Another big issue that has come up is kind of the non-traditional climate change, non-physical effects in our waterways that can in fact impair, delay, preclude fish migration, things like water chemistry, warming water temperatures, a lack or no water in a stream, and how do these laws apply to those types of scenarios where you don't have a physical man-made structure placed in waters of the state. We have had a lot of uncertainty around the definition of benefit from the landowner's perspective. How does the department, what is a beneficial effect? What kind of habitat is beneficial to fish, and what's important from a fish passes perspective? So that's another issue we spent a fair bit of time on, actually looking at a definition that defines no benefits to fish and trying to provide clarity and rule to help the landowner understand what types of habitats may not be beneficial from a fish perspective. culverts and design standards reflecting some of the proposed and predicted climate changing conditions, particularly the increased hydrograph, more water coming quicker, and the sizing of standard culvert sizes. And then that coupled with the forest accord and some of the issues through that process. And then public safety at dams. That's another issue that has surfaced. You know, when is a public safety issue exempt at a dam from the state's fish passage rules and regulations? So that's just a quick summary of 4 or 5 issues we've unearthed. And we're going to speak to this a fair bit more when we provide you our fish passage rule revision initiative later this summer. Just a quick on timeline. I just kind of spoke to this. We've been at this about a year, a very, what I like to believe is transparent public process, an effective website. We just met earlier this week, specific to dams and benefit analyses discussions. And we've had over the course now close to 300 comments publicly across many, many stakeholders. And again, our goal was to come forward with a comprehensive revision of rules for your consideration later this fall, with the intent to really provide clarity where necessary, strengthen our fish passage triggers, provide more certainty and clear guidance on certain design criteria, really trying to bridge the gap between some areas where there are inconsistencies between the state and federal fish passage requirements, expanding on the native migratory fish list, and obviously rolling this out in developing guidance, documentation, and an education program for the public. And with that, I think we're at a transition point.
Hey, Greg, I just want to butt in here for a second and try not to embarrass you too much, but I just want to acknowledge how much of a lift this rulemaking is. And when you think about the rulemaking we did for the Rogue South Coast, and we had a whole team on that, it's largely Greg with some support from Alan and Catherine that are really carrying this. When you think about the stakeholders we had engaged in the Rogue South Coast, it was a narrow group of folks that are primarily interested in fish. Here, there's a really broad kind of section of Oregon who are really interested in fish passage and passage. And I think in the response to Commissioner Khalil earlier, Greg outlined some of those interests. And they're all following this process and weighing in on it. And it's really falling to Greg to kind of manage and facilitate that and get us to a place where we think there's a rule package that can both advance things for fish, but recognize all the needs that are out there on the landscape. And so, yeah, Greg, just huge appreciation for you and Alan and Catherine for pulling that off.
Thank you, Sean, from the team you just mentioned. Yeah, it's been a lot of work and we've got a ways to go, but thank you.
Thank you for mentioning that, Sean. And just before that, and maybe we could echo our thanks in advance from the commission as well. These things are so time consuming and not easy. So thank you. Just before we leave this and take a quick break, I want to make sure that Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde and Commissioner Zarnowitz got their question answered about the difference between the programmatic and the waiver and the exemption, because that was an important piece that kind of drove us to, that was a big question coming into this. So I just want to make sure that you got what you wanted. And if not, we could maybe have a quick summary from one of the 3 staff people when we start again after the 5-minute break.
I feel like I understand what happened there, and that it's a unique situation, but right now it's unique, and it may be able to be applied in other situations where there's major projects going on, multiple projects.
And I would just say, I think my understanding is that in the ODOT situation, they're making partial improvements. They are putting money into a fund, and it doesn't permanently exempt them from a more permanent fix in the future. Is that right?
Absolutely accurate.
Okay, thank you. That is helpful. And that
I would add one more thing in that Hatfield or Commissioner Hyde, we do have another programmatic in place. It's been in place now nearly 15 years. And that's with the Washington County Road Department and their maintenance program. And that programmatic has been very efficient and effective and saves not only staff time and resources, but saves Washington County. What that programmatic does is it pre-approves projects that are going to in fact trigger fish passes, primarily at culverts and some bridges for Washington County. It pre-approves upfront and really expedites a lot of process that takes a lot of time for both our staff and their staff to submit applications, go through the process. We have worked with them, Washington County, closely. That programmatic pre-approves, pre-authorizes projects so long as they meet and achieve certain conditions. And those conditions are they fully achieve fish passage under a stream simulation design approach. And then they report annually where they implemented those actions. And during that annual report, we look forward to the next in-water work window the next year. We're doing that right now, as a matter of fact. That project, that programmatic has saved Washington County a lot of resources, having to go through the process instead of individually permitting and submitting applications. We pre-approve those if they can meet certain design criteria, and they show us retrospectively how they met those design outcome goals and criteria for fish. So that's another example of a programmatic that you haven't heard about. And tomorrow there may be a new programmatic concept that comes forward that we can fund the commission. So that's the other side of the programmatic coin, if I may.
Thank you. And thank you, Chair Wall, for letting me process that back.
You
Because
bet.
it has been frustrating.
Then let's take you're welcome. And I'm glad we got through that one and got it cleared a little bit at least. Let's come back at 2:42, 5 minutes, and be real prompt. And we'll have then about 45 minutes to go. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure how I mute here.
Welcome back, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. And with thanks again to you, Greg, for all of that presentation and perspective and information that you gave us. And now we'll move, I think, to Alan Ritchie. And Alan, if you would reintroduce just your part of the top of the presentation so we have the overview, that would be great.
Sure. So I'm Alan Ritchie, the Fish Greens and Passage Program Manager, and I'm going to try and address some of the remaining topics that were, the list of questions, the list of agendas, probably some of the budget issues, how our program operates. I do think Greg wasn't quite talking. I think he wants to talk a little bit more, maybe cover one more slide on commission authority, and then I'll start in and we've through the questions we've gotten into some of the material that I've got, so I might skip a bit of material or we can repeat, but yeah, we'll get through this and hopefully be in a good timely fashion. But Greg's going to talk a little bit more about your actual authority and where we have enforcement authority, I guess.
Okay, back to you, Greg. Thank you.
I don't think I've ever seen Greg speechless before.
He's on mute.
So I can cover this as well, and Greg can correct me where I'm wrong, but this is coming really just straight out of statute and rule, existing authorities that we have in place right now, and kind of lays out where the commission has some specific authorities. I think Greg's already covered the waivers and exemptions. When the trigger site has greater than a mile of habitat, that automatically goes to the commission for review and approval, in addition to the task force and all of the normal department and task force roles. We can also take any others to the commission if there's a potentially, a particularly hot issue, more contentious, a lot of public outcry or whatever. We can certainly take those to the commission as well. But by and large, that 1 mile trigger is what winds up going before the commission, such as you'll see tomorrow. The statewide fish passage priority list, we've covered that a little bit. That goes for commission approval every 5 years. That also has a fairly extensive public process, task force role, and ultimately goes before the commission for approval. And then we get into where are some unique passage enforcement language that we really haven't instituted. We haven't encountered these. The commission can require fish passage at priority barriers if the commission comes up with 60% of the costs. Fish passage projects, especially some of your higher priority, larger projects, can be really expensive to implement. And, all construction projects are getting even more expensive, seems like, with every week that goes by. We haven't ever taken a project before the commission to, force the issue and come up with 60% of the costs. I'll get into funds a little bit later. We have some new funding opportunities over the last 6 months, but this is not something that we've ever gone before you with. The other challenge with implementing passage projects at a site with an unwilling landowner is, there's certainly concerns about ongoing operations and maintenance with an unwilling landowner. And we really try to put a lot of effort into working cooperatively, describing the benefits of fish passage, describing their role, and trying to find a way to cost share and work in a more cooperative means. Another measure here that we haven't explored before is without regard to funding. We don't have to come up with 60% of the costs if the Fish and Wildlife Commission declares an emergency at a barrier. We do define emergency elsewhere in rule that references at the population scale. So that's been a challenge where we would see, an emergency at the population scale that you can point to a particular barrier on the map and say that barrier is creating a population level emergency. So we haven't encountered that yet, but that's certainly something that could be discussed in the future. If there's a barrier that is just illegally installed, there's no water right, it was never installed, it's been documented as an illegal diversion, that can certainly be something that you can enforce fish passage at. We haven't encountered anything of that nature yet as well. And then this last one is kind of a culmination of the others. if fish passage was required, the landowner had an order to address fish passage, remove the barrier, install a fish ladder or whatever, and they just flat out say no, well, then the Fish and Wildlife Commission can order its repair or replacement at their expense if they've already been required to address fish passage and they choose not to. So that is kind of addresses Commissioner King's question earlier, I guess, in what the options are. But, you know, to my knowledge, none of these 4 dashes have been implemented yet. Greg, is that close to what you were going to say?
Spot on. Thank you, Alan.
Oh, you're back.
I am.
So you want to advance to the next slide, please?
Yes, sir.
So I guess for starters, I want to clarify that it's not just ODFW implementing fish passage projects. Watershed councils, other agencies, SWCDs, NGOs are all involved in fish passage restoration and implement many projects with a variety of grant funds. So Greg described the scope of the problem earlier, and ODFW's passage resources really aren't that large to address, you know, the many thousands of barriers that are out there. You know, we have passage triggers generated across the state based on maintenance and other construction triggers that have to be processed. Where fish currently or historically existed, ODFW works with the owner to ensure passage triggers are appropriately addressed through a design review process that results in an issuance of a fish passage approval, as we discussed earlier. In some cases, this can result in a fish passage waiver or exemption. And you know, these are really a large amount of workload. Looking just at exemptions, I went back over our history of exemptions, and it looks like we have issued approximately 90 exemptions. And I would say on the conservative side, each exemption takes at least 40 hours of staff time to process. So that's a lot of hours. That's about 3,600 hours of time spent on exemptions. And these are projects with really no appreciable benefit to fish. You know, we would like to spend more of our time directed at beneficial priority sites. So we are looking for ways to streamline the exemption process, and that may come out of the rule development process that we bring back to the commission later this year. But with time left over after kind of the triggers and addressing triggers and actions that we really have to process, then we are looking at more targeted restoration opportunities where we can maximize the benefit to migratory fish. And this includes gaining cooperation from owners, considering the biological needs and passage engineering principles to implement these successful projects. And I'll get into more program administration and funding in just a couple slides. Prioritization, I'm not going to spend much time on this. We've already discussed the prioritization a lot. You know, we're going to kick off the next prioritization towards the end of this year. That'll give us most of 23 to kind of develop the next prioritization with the intent of bringing it back before the commission in 24. You know, we use this a lot. This directs a lot of our effort work. We certainly hear from watershed councils, OWEB, and other entities how much this is used. It's certainly not the only prioritization out there. There are local assessments such as the salmon superhighway that are super valuable as well on a more local, smaller scale than the statewide prioritization that we use. But this has been a valuable tool, and every time we do this, it is kind of amazing how many projects come off of it. The frustrating part with it, kind of like I mentioned earlier, you know, at least with the last 2 prioritizations that have been implemented since I've been in the program, undoubtedly a month after the commission approves the prioritization, we learn of a couple new projects that aren't new, just new to us, that would have been on the prioritization, and we'll certainly have some of those this time as well as removing however many barriers from the 2019 are addressed in the interim. So let's move on to the next one, Greg. So fish passage restoration. You know, the passage program works with field staff and other resources to identify where passage restoration funds will do the most good for fish and where to invest our collective resources. We have field staff and local partners are often the ones engaged in early discussions and on the ground trying to gain cooperation. The statewide fish passage prioritization that we mentioned is one of the first tools that's incorporated into this assessment. And we also utilize the local recovery plans, local assessments, species recovery plans that are looking at other factors. But in the end, I mean, for a good fish passage project, the funds are generally going to be found. There's generally a technical solution that's going to address it. but the restoration depends on collaboration with willing owners and partners. And sometimes that can take a lot of discussion, a lot of explaining how the project will work, a lot of discussion on why it's important that site. And that's where projects can struggle for a couple of years many times. Program resources. So how do we implement this program? I guess for starters, we're really fortunate to have some talented people that are passionate about fish passage and the role it plays in the larger goal of fish restoration. Taking a quick step back, we're focused on fish passage today, but this program is embedded within the larger fish screening and passage program. Also want to, separate, we have 2 staff that are funded by ODOT, and they're dedicated solely to administering the fish passage program on ODOT projects. But outside of the ODOT program, Greg is the only person we have dedicated to the statewide fish passage program, and that's a real challenge. And we have many other staff that are working on passage and screening and have a blend of duties. Even in the field, we have screens and passage staff that are also partially funded through the Habitat program, district duties. So we have a large program that's working on fish screening, fish passage. We get involved in other various district duties, certainly with the appropriate funding behind it. But as far as our statewide program, you've been listening all morning, or I guess all afternoon, to our sole fish passage representative. What else we got here? So I guess looking at our statewide program and how we implement and process all these different projects, we also have 2 screening and passage engineers. 3 of those sit in Salem and 1 sits in Eastern Oregon. We also have staff in the Dalles, John Day, Enterprise, and Central Point that survey, design, fabricate, install, and maintain fish screening and passage projects. I don't know how familiar you are with the screens and passage facilities in the field, but these are fully functioning shops with equipment and skilled staff that build and maintain fish screens and passage projects from the ground up. So fish screening and passage is a unique and challenging field in the design and construction world, and we're really fortunate to have the skilled staff that we have with decades of experience really in this field. I also want to make sure and recognize that we have a lot of district staff engaged in the fish passage program. They're providing data, oftentimes completing the benefit analyses that we see, and in some cases issuing fish passage approvals as well. Our district staff, as you folks well know, are pulled in a million different directions and usually don't have the time to engage with barrier owners at the level necessary, but they are issuing some of these passage approvals and making sure these projects are addressing fish passage needs. So funds, when it comes to funding fish passage projects, I guess I'm going to divide this into 2 types: the triggered projects and voluntary restoration sites. When fish passage is triggered through the various actions described earlier, the owner is responsible to fund the project. There may be some funding options available to help cost share the expense, but most funders are not inclined to invest a lot of restoration funds at sites where fish passage is already required. So taking advantage of these cost share opportunities requires planning before the obstruction has failed and needs replacement. When fish passage is triggered at an existing barrier is not looked at as restoration, but in reality, this is how we catch up and restore passage at the many historic sites that were in existence when our current statutes and rules were approved. In the last 5 years, we've issued over 870 fish passage approvals. Now, some of these were new installations, but most of those were triggers at existing obstructions. And then we have other projects that are implemented as voluntary restoration projects. In this case, there are a number of state and federal and non-governmental organizations that can help cost share fish passage restoration projects. I think you got ahead of me just a hair, Greg, but we're rolling. So one of those programs that I wanted to describe to you is the ODFW Fish Screening and Passage Cost Share Program. This program is largely implemented with funds through the Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund. You might hear us refer to that as PCSRF or even PACSURF. Yeah, can you go back 1 slide, Greg?
I can.
There we go. So as you can see on the slide, our PACSURF allocation for this biennium is over $4 million. Now these Our PACSR funds are for both screening and passage. We don't have, this isn't divvied up for passage or screening or other things. It's for the blend of fish screening and passage and the whole statewide program that I mentioned earlier among the 5 facilities. PCSRF funds we use to do a lot of good screening and passage work on the ground. However, it is restricted only to those areas with anadromy. We have to show a benefit to salmon, steelhead, anadromous species to use PCSRF funds. So that leaves a good chunk of Oregon that we really aren't able to provide support for. We also receive about $945,000 in general fund to administer the screens and passage program. And the last piece that I wanted to list here that makes up our passage program is a surcharge on each angling license that goes into a dedicated fish passage account. So this surcharge was established in 2009 at 25 cents, and it remains at that level today. The purchase power of this surcharge is nowhere near what it was in 2009. And actually last biennium, we had to eliminate our other dedicated fish passage position due to this lack of funds. We do have a legislative concept in place and submitted for the next 23-25 session that may help with the statewide passage program. But for this biennium, we have an allocation of $384,000 in our passage surcharge funds and one statewide position to implement this program that we've heard about today. We've talked a lot about ODOT and the culvert repair programmatic agreement. This has become a significant source of funds that we turn into projects on the ground that restore fish passage. Since 2015, we've received $4.3 million. And thanks to you approving the new culvert repair agreement at the last meeting, this triggers another $4.4 million in passage funds that we will receive this coming year. And then we'll receive more over the following 10 years, depending on how much they utilize this culvert repair agreement. And these funds will go directly to projects on the ground. And then we certainly have a number of other entities that fund fish passage projects that I think you're all aware of: OWEB, National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service. And just recently, we have a few new sources of funds that have become available for restoration projects that I think we're going to get into with a little more in-depth discussion later that we can cover in a bit. All right, now the next one, Greg. So fortunately, there's been a lot of positive energy towards restoring fish passage in Oregon. When we revised the 2013 passage priority list and turned it into the 2019 list, that revision, we identified 75 high priority barriers that had been implemented in the interim. So these, were some of the highest priority sites in the state where we expect to see the most benefit to fish. And this is in addition to the many other projects implemented that were not identified on the priority list. We'll go through and review these accomplishments again on the 2019 list as we kick off the next version and bring it back to you in a couple of years. Our ODOT program we've allocated funds to 32 projects since 2015. Not all of those have been implemented yet. We just did another RF request for proposal last year, but 20 of those projects have been implemented with 12 more approved grant agreements either issued or underway and scheduled for implementation in 2022 and 2023. And we plan to do another outreach effort for projects next winter as we get close to this additional kicker of $4.3 million in ODOT passage dollars. Looking at our cost share program, just kind of laying out the numbers of projects that we're more involved with. We've installed 49 passage projects through the ODFW cost share program for that 2016 to 21 period. And these 49 projects equate to about 760 miles of habitat in Oregon that have been opened up through this cost share program, with partial program through the cost share program, certainly not all of them. And then, as I said earlier, certainly over 870 passage approvals during that same period. Not all of those are restoration projects. Most of those are triggered projects, but still it's opening up passage at all those sites. We don't have a great accounting of the miles of habitat opened up at every site that's triggered and not run through our cost share program those are there's just a lot of those coming in and would take a lot of workload from a lot of different folks in the field to track the mileage at each project that triggers fish passage. We're really looking at, what fish are there, what do we need to meet fish passage criteria at those sites. The drought resiliency fund. So in the 2022 legislative session had an end of session funding bill that included $8 million in general fund dollars for fish passage barrier removal in this same and current biennium. This was a surprise, somewhat came a little bit out of the blue, at least to me. This is really exciting, and it's also a really challenging timeline. Most fish passage projects are implemented in the summer. We have one summer left in this biennium, and that's in just a couple of months. So we're currently working with staff and other entities to identify projects. We're targeting projects in identified department focal areas that are either ready for construction, short on funds, or projects that need design time. You can't really implement a fish passage project without a good design. That may involve hiring consultants depending on the complexity of the fish passage project. So I've got a lot of projects rolling in from a lot of groups as we speak, looking at how we're going to spend these funds to do the best for fish passage. Initially, I was concerned at this late date how we would make this happen, but I'm surprised at how many kind of construction ready projects that are shorter on funds are coming in. Part of this is due to inflation and the cost of construction projects and the materials that go into construction projects. We've got some good projects that, based on their cost estimate 2 years ago, thought that they were ready. And now steel, concrete, everything has gone up, and there's a number of projects that are short on funds and ready to go. So we'll be meeting with the director's office and others to kind of gavel down on how we're going to allocate that $8 million, but that's pretty exciting to get that gift and put that on the ground here in relatively short order. Infrastructure Investment and Job Act funds. This is also a relatively new funding source that came about in 2021. Shortly, we're going to be transitioning into a discussion on opportunities to use these funds. I think there's going to be some facilitated discussions on these different focal areas. I did go through and looked at our current statewide fish passage priority list and identified the number of barriers on our priority list in each of the identified focal areas here, which I think kind of wrapping up and ready to transition into that. But I did want to, I guess, take a moment beforehand just to thank Greg for taking on this discussion of how we apply Oregon's fish passage authority on the ground. This is the world he lives in every day and interacts with barrier owners and partners across the state. It's not always a super positive message to be delivered and received, but he has a lot of skills and can find creative solutions and work with people to try and accommodate the barrier owners' needs while definitely taking care of our fish passage needs as well. With that, any other questions over what we've discussed today before we dive into the next item that I think Debbie is on?
Yeah, maybe Chair Wall, while we're doing that, we'll get the next slides teed up while we're taking a few questions, if that's okay with you.
Okay, let's go ahead with Commissioner King. I have a question also, and I bet there will be a couple other hands up. And Debbie, just to be clear, you said you're gonna talk a little bit about the next part?
Yeah, we've got actually a few folks that are going to take you through a little bit more detail on this federal funding piece that Alan mentioned.
Okay, Commissioner King, and then I'll ask a question, and there might be one other. Go ahead, Commissioner King.
Thank you, Chair Wall. My question, I think it's related to funding in general. So I sort of got an answer, I think, at the last meeting from ODOT. But I just don't find it sufficient. So I'm not sure how we get a sufficient one. ODOT owns the road. ODOT has a tremendously large budget compared to ours. The culverts are theirs. So how do we work their contribution? How does that, and then we come up with this, do 10 in 10 years or whatever. How does all of that translate? I think that's what's just, I find so on their part inadequate. It's sort of like, I understand, like, I guess if we just left it to them, they would do nothing for the fish. Is that kind of why we're kind of trying so hard to work with them and accepting what I consider a relatively low number?
Commissioner King, I wouldn't at all say that they would do nothing for fish. We have a great working relationship with ODOT, and they have a dedicated fish passage program. I certainly didn't cover that in my funding slide today, but they have fish passage staff, they have regional environmental staff, and they are certainly have their own priority list that they work with us on to develop. We would all like to see more of those developed and implemented in a shorter timeline. We could talk with ODOT about getting some more information on their funding source, or their funding amounts and how they implement that. We do know that ODOT projects are typically really expensive. Shutting down I-5 to implement a project, the amount of fill and the size of their projects can get into the millions of dollars super fast. I know that's just money, but that is the reality of every state agency. They have so many dollars to implement their mission, and for ODOT, they're looking at what they can do for the traveling public, and they're certainly addressing fish passage as they're doing that. I don't know that I have a better response for you on ODOT's.
No, I think you've done well. I mean, I understand that they are trying, quote unquote, and that, they do have dedicated people. We have joint people. They pay for that position. Like, I get all that. But I'm still thinking, like, all of this infrastructure rolling through, they are getting billions. They are getting a veritable ton of money. And they're giving us $4 million for culverts to fix 15 of them or something like that. I just, and there's thousands that we need fixed. I just cannot wrap my head around that deficit. Like, it just to me seems like it's low and imbalanced. But I mean, there's clearly something I'm not understanding, and I didn't really get an answer when I asked the ODOT guy.
So, Commissioner King, one thing I do want to clarify is the money that they give us, none of that money goes on the ODOT road. We're applying that to non-ODOT projects. We're using that on using our fish passage priority list. ODOT has their own funds and their own fish passage program that they're applying to their road system. And it's certainly more than the money that they're giving us, but none of our 4.4 million or the 4.3 million, depending on where you want to start the math on that, but none of that is maintaining ODOT's highway. That's all going to we're taking that and doing better for fish than if you would have taken that and used it to repair all of the sites that they triggered. How much their entire budget is for addressing their road system, and I don't have a great answer for that. I know as part of our culvert repair agreement, that requires them to continue to fund their own internal fish passage program. I think it's 4.4 million, between 4.2 and 4.4 million that they have to continue to fund at a bare minimum to address, the priority passage sites on the ODOT road system, in addition to when they trigger a replacement or, do a traditional fish passage trigger.
Maybe, Madam Chair, Commissioner King, maybe that's something we can kind of pick back up with the kind of gaps and how do we make more progress conversation.
That sounds great. Why don't we skip my question for now, right now, and go to what you were hoping to talk about on the federal money coming in and the new money coming in. And then I'd like to go back to a question about priorities, but let's go ahead with this just in the interest of time.
Okay, I'm going to kick it off, and then we've got a couple of other folks that are joining for this, and I know that we are starting to kind of run up on the planned time for this segment, so we'll try to not go too slow. But I want to just mention, when Alan mentions the fact that, and you'll hear more about this in my legislative update tomorrow, receiving $8 million this point in the biennium and trying to spend it, I think we will be able to spend it. We're going to spend it on really smart projects. And the reason why is because we have our priorities so well mapped out. We're ready for that kind of windfall. And it's a credit to the kind of programs that we have that we can pivot so quickly and work so fast. And that we are well positioned with our partners to go out and find those shovel-ready projects on a very fast timeline. We wanted to just touch with you today, kind of switching gears a little bit to the federal infrastructure dollars. And it's much bigger than fish passage, but fish passage is probably going to be such a big part of so many of the areas that we're working that we felt like it was a good fit to sneak this in as an update for you. So I'm sure many of you are aware that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed just 4 months ago in November. And when you hear about it in the news, a lot of times you're hearing about kind of the traditional infrastructure pieces of it, like money being earmarked for states for bridges and rail and roads and all these other types of forms of transportation. But in addition to that money, there's about $11 billion directed to 9 federal agencies to invest in creating healthy natural areas. I think it's pretty cool. I mean, if you just pause to think about that, we have a National Infrastructure Act that included $11 billion for natural areas. It's not what people think of often when they're thinking of infrastructure. So I think that's pretty neat. And just to give you a feel for some of the money that we're talking about, it's, you know, 162 million earmarks for the Klamath Basin, 50 million for sagebrush, 900 million in Department of Interior for ecosystem restoration, 100 million for fish passage. I mean, the list goes on and on. So, you know, from our perspective, when this rolled out in November, we really saw this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for conservation and communities in Oregon. That $11 billion is not earmarked for states, which means that we really have to pull those dollars to Oregon. And that's kind of, you know, what we have been trying to do in terms of talking to our partners, the federal agencies, our federal delegation, really trying to tee Oregon up to receive as many of those dollars to get that work done on the ground. A couple of things to be aware of. These dollars are only going to be around for 5 years. So we have a sense of urgency about positioning ourselves quickly. And what we also talk about is this is not about bringing dollars to Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. From our perspective, this is about doing great things in Oregon. A piece of this is that a large amount of the money that we're talking about is not through existing programs. Some existing programs got a bump, and we're really familiar with those programs, and we know how to apply. We know what the criteria. Many of these dollars were actually new programs. And so for the last 4 months, we have been trying at all levels to try to talk to our federal partners about what we need in Oregon in the hope that we could influence what criteria they created for their new programs. So, you know, before they were even rolling out grant programs, we wanted to tell them, hey, these are the kinds of dollars and the kind of projects we have here in Oregon that we need help with. The other piece that we realized, I mean, when you're talking $11 billion, and we don't have a lot of capacity, I mean, in terms of grant writers and everything else, we quickly realized that, you know, we've got to really focus. And so we took a look really in December, where do we see areas in the state where we think we can make progress in 5 years, significant progress in 5 years? Where were there existing plans or stakeholder efforts in place that we could leverage quickly, like, you know, project lists? And where did we have strong partners that we could work with? And then also, what was a good fit for funding? Because not, you know, we really have to make the projects fit with what's available. So today, we just wanted to take you, again, we know that this afternoon is about fish passage, but as you'll see, that's so woven into so many of these focal areas that we just thought it was a good time to brief you on the overall effort. So we're just going to kind of tag team. I think I'll turn next to Sean, and he's going to tell you about a few of these focal areas.
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, so we have 6 focal areas in total, and 4 of them really focus on aquatic systems. And as kind of Ellen alluded to earlier, all 4 of those have a really big fish passage component that we're looking to address in the next 5 years. I'm going to speak to 3 of them, and then we're going to bring in the closer with Jeff Yankee to kind of tell you the story about Wallowa. And I think it's a really good story. And then Craig's going to finish up by just explaining kind of what we've been able to achieve to date in terms of bringing investments in and some of the programs he and Andrea are targeting. So the Rogue Basin, you all heard about that late last year. As we go forward implementing that plan, I think you'll recall that what we said down there is we really need to focus investments in some of these areas that are going to be vulnerable to climate change, like the Middle Rogue. And passage is a big part of that focus, providing the opportunities for fish to get further up in the basins where it's cooler. And so there's a whole range of passage barriers that have been identified by Dan Van Dyke and Steve Measure down there that he and Chandra and others are working now to kind of prioritize and tee up with Craig and in the hopes of getting those addressed so that we can get fish through into these resilient areas. I think there's just huge opportunity there, and they've been able to make a lot of progress in the last few years, pulling out dams down there and addressing barriers. Then we turn to Oregon Coast Coho. Again, the commission heard an update on the 12-year assessment last year, and we're in a place now where we're pretty close to being able to say that they could be delisted. Biologically, they're doing really well. We're still a long ways from our broad sense goals, but that's, that was a 50-year process there. They've come through a really poor ocean conditions, really resiliently. And now we're looking at implementing the private forest accord. And then with IIJA, I think we're in a place where we could get close in the next 5 years, if not there. And so again, passage barriers are a key part of what we need to address to delist Coast Coho. And I think as Commissioner Labhart indicated, that he was out on the tour yesterday, the Salmon Superhighway project that's been working for years is being able to put some really good things on the ground. And Craig's going to talk a little bit about what they've been able to pull in from IIJA to date. And then there's the strategic action plans that have been developed through the Coho Business Plan by Wild Salmon Center and others. That's really helped us prioritize where we need to work and what passage barriers we need to address. And so we're teeing off that with all the partners that are already in those basins to try and just bring funding in so that they can get those projects implemented. And then finally, we've got Klamath. There was 162 million earmarked specifically for the Klamath. And then in addition, they can also access that $11 billion. And the Klamath, what we're going to see here in the next couple of decades, is the biggest restoration project in the world. So it's a place where we would see huge opportunity, but there's also real problems there right now. There's scarcity problems with water, and we're seeing that play out on the landscape. And so what we really need to do there is bring in solutions, funding from IIJA that can help the communities there secure a resilient future for themselves and also for the fish. And so that's where our focus is going to be, primarily on the passage and screening side of things. So I want to turn it over to Jeff now to talk a bit about the Wallowa project, which I think is really cool.
As we transition to Jeff, I didn't mention in terms of us trying to focus these efforts and the criteria we used, we have stood up teams internally around each one of them. And so Jeff has led the effort, for example, on Wallowa. And so for each of these focal areas, we've got teams that are kind of working actively with our stakeholders and staff across the agency and other agencies. Go ahead, Jeff. Sorry about that.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Debbie. Good afternoon, commissioners, colleagues. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Yankee. I'm the watershed manager in Grand Ronde in Northeast Oregon. I've been with the department for about 17 years, and for the majority of my career, I was a district fish biologist up here in the Wallowa district, which basically covers Wallowa County. And, I joined a little late just for this section, but I hope what you've learned thus far is that at the district level, these fish passage projects are a really strong sell. One, for funding agencies, because there's very tangible benefits in terms of opening up unoccupied habitat, reducing transition time through passage, through diversion structures. But then also too, there's a huge win-win there for these landowners when we're simultaneously helping them reduce their liability towards fish impacts while we're actually opening up that habitat, providing that passage. So in the 10 years I spent as a district fish biologist, we were able to implement a lot of fish passage projects with partners and stakeholders throughout the Wallowa Basin in tributaries that addressed extant species like Chinook, salmon, and steelhead and bull trout. But at the head of the Wallowa Basin is Wallowa Lake, and it's a natural glacial lake that has a dam on it that stores about 50,000 acre feet of some of the coldest, cleanest water Oregon has to offer each year. And the dam at the outlet of the lake is about over 100 years old and is a high hazard dam. And it is it's a flood risk for the downstream communities. In addition, the Water Resources Department, by designated as high hazard, reduced the storage capacity of the lake by about 70% for irrigators. Now, the interesting piece of history about Wallowa Lake is that it hosted one of Oregon's only 2 native sockeye populations and the only one in the Snake River. They went extinct at the turn of the 20th century. And while there were several factors involved in them going extinct, fish passage has always hampered our efforts, being ODFW and our tribal co-managers, to help reintroduce sockeye to their habitat in Wallowa Lake. So I'm gonna leave it there because I think the story is best told by a video that our I&E staff, Adam Baylor, put together last year, which kind of explains some of the efforts that we're trying to undertake here at Wallowa. And it's a little broader than fish passage, but it's a good story. And I'll let Sean transition over to the video if he's ready.
Sure.
Hi there, I'm Governor Kate Brown. The rehabilitation of Wallowa Lake Dam and the return of the sockeye salmon has been a long-standing project that I've supported. I'm so pleased to see it moving forward. Wallowa Lake is a very special place for countless Oregon families, mine included. This natural glacial lake, which was dammed in the early 1900s, still provides irrigation, flood control, and drinking water to the towns of Joseph, Enterprise, and Wallowa. The dam has also blocked fish, such as the sockeye salmon, from completing their journey in the Wallowa River. But today, because of the hard work of many local stakeholders in developing a memorandum of agreement, the dam will finally see repairs to make it operationally safe and allow for the fish to migrate. This exciting agreement is the product of the good work and good faith collaboration of the Wallowa Lake Irrigation District, Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Nez Perce Tribe, and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Thank you to all of these partners for working together to find a sustainable solution. This accomplishment is a beautiful example of the Oregon way. We get things done by working together. When we collaborate based on our shared values, we can rise to the occasion each and every time. Congratulations and thank you.
So Wallowa Lake hosted one of Oregon's only 2 sockeye salmon populations and the only one here in the Snake River. At the turn of the 20th century, sockeye salmon from Wallowa Lake went extinct due to multitudes of factors, one being which overharvest in the main stem Columbia Snake Rivers. They were being swept into irrigation fields. There was misguided hatchery practices, and then also a lot of passage barriers on the landscape too, most notably here at Wallowa Lake Dam that prevented sockeye salmon from accessing spawning and rearing habitat here in Wallowa Lake.
So back in the 70s, after the Teton Dam failure, this was labeled as high hazard. And back in 1996, we were limited to a 72% capacity storage. Because of that, a lot of our father's generations and mothers got together and were trying to find different ways to rehabilitate this to get back up to full capacity. It was built in phases. So one of the first constructions was back in 1919. It was extended 3 feet higher a few years later and another additional 5 feet in 1929. It provides 50,000 acre feet of water for Wallowa Valley irrigators and also supplies water for the city of Joseph. But overall, throughout the whole county, it affects about 37,000 acres. And it also provides flood control for many of the municipalities downstream from us, protecting millions of dollars of commercial real estate and residential real estate along the rivers. So many of the stakeholders have not just been the irrigators, but also the community at large, because it affects all of us. But this storage increase is vital to our community, not just to the irrigators, but also to the fisheries as well. Because if this funding goes through, hopefully we can supply some water for some critical stretches throughout the Wallowa River system.
That's maybe Waiklo Muma, Kalatiwama. Inamunikwas, we at Natu height. So Yaputimki, Casey Mitchell. I said in my language is good morning, friends and relatives. My Nimipu name, which comes from this land, is Sun Necklace. And my English name is Casey Mitchell. I serve as the treasurer for the Nez Perce Tribal Executive Committee. It's the governing body for the Nez Perce tribe, also known as Nimipu. It's been, over 100 years since we were able to fish sockeye here in the Wallowa River, or Wallowa Lake. The sockeye were anadromous fish, and what anadromous fish means is that they're able to go from freshwater to saltwater, back to freshwater. And that's a very important piece to the health and well-being, not only of the Nez Perce tribe, but of the environment as well.
My name is Jeremy Wolf. My Indian name is Ilbilt, and I'm the vice chair of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. Some of the challenges we've had with getting to this point, I think it's been initially tied with the irrigators, have been trying to do this work for 40 years plus. It's been kind of a lot of on their shoulders. They reached out to the tribes. And so it's really been the fruition of all that coordination and communication, trying to figuring out what things we can agree on, things that we can benefit one another. Irrigators have their interests, but they don't have to be in competition with what the benefit of the system is. More of clean, cold water benefits everybody, including the ecosystem, including the fish and the people that are dependent upon it. And I think that the first things first is, those relationships had to be not only, those doors had to be open, but through an MOA, we solidified those relationships for the future.
There was two things that we wanted to see done in that MOA: sufficient water for the fish that come up that river, and then the other part was to see sockeyes return back to this lake, back to those rivers, in somehow in the near future that we're able to build a pass for those fish to go up and down that dam to be able to come up to spawn, but also to go back down to the ocean as well.
Once fish passage is restored at Wallowa Lake Dam, there are still several hurdles we'll have to overcome to make a reintroduction program for sockeye successful. One of which is unscreened irrigation diversions and passage barriers directly below the dam. And then also farther downstream in the migratory corridor, you have high water temperatures in the lower Grand Ronde and in the Snake River reservoirs, in addition to predators like smallmouth bass that eat sockeye salmon smolts as they migrate out to the ocean. But then also within Wallowa Lake, we need to consider the fact that the Wallowa Lake of 120 years ago is different from the Wallowa Lake of today. And since then, the spawning habitat above the lake and the river has been channelized. So what used to be a vast network of small channels for sockeye to spawn in is now just one big channel above the lake. We also have, through time, reintroduced non-native species like mysis shrimp that compete with kokanee and sockeye salmon for food resources. We also have lake trout that directly eat young sockeye salmon before they migrate out to the ocean. But then it's important to consider that there's an absence of adult sockeye salmon that used to bring vital nutrients back from the ocean that started the food cycle and the food web of Wallowa Lake from the very base that's been absent for hundreds of years.
So I think MOAs or MOUs, whatever it might be, are really important to understanding and having those agreements to lay that groundwork for the new leadership that steps in. So they understand what we're trying to accomplish, the challenges that we've gone through. And when we get to the point where the next steps need to be made, that agreement holds strong to that legacy, holds strong to the history of what we're trying to accomplish here. You know, it's you know, there are going to be new ideas as we move forward, and I think that you know, maybe some things can be rewritten, some things can be added or taken away, but at the same time, there's a foundation for collaboration, communication, and success.
So I hope you all enjoyed that little backstory on Wallowa Lake. But before we move on, I'll just mention that, you know, Wallowa Lake Dam was really the linchpin that he had to be pulled to open up our opportunity there on passage projects that remain in the Wallowa Basin. But through those partnerships that you got to look into, that we're ready to really pounce on these opportunities together as a large stakeholder group, and move forward and really provide that free passage through the Wallowa Lake system, through the Wallowa Basin system from the lake to the ocean. And with that, we'll move on to the next. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jeff. So Craig's just going to give you a quick overview of kind of where we're at right now.
Hey, everybody. Craig Smith. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst within Fish Division. So just kind of re-emphasize a few points that Debbie brought up. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act really is a program that brought in trillions of dollars nationwide. And through the bill, we had to look at where these programs fit within our focal areas. So we identified 41 federal programs within 9 different federal agencies where it fit very well in developing our 6 focal areas. What that bill program provided was an additional appropriation to existing programs, but it also identified several opportunities to fund new programs. And so we are currently working through fiscal year 22 and into the federal fiscal year of 23 to work with our federal partners on several programs that are under development. We're working with NOAA and their new barrier removal program to identify and align projects along the Oregon coast, as well as Wallowa River. We're working with Bureau of Reclamation on 2 of their new programs to benefit watershed health, as well as aquatic ecosystem restoration to identify ways for water resiliency, fish passage, and better water use in the state of Oregon. We're also working with U.S. Forest Service on their Good Neighbor Authority agreements to align that for wildfire protection, forest health, and for fish passage through their Resource Legacy Road and Trail program. We're also working with Fish and Wildlife Service on several of their dam removal and fish passage programs. One of the current ones that we've been able to secure is the National Fish Passage Program. We have about $4 million in regional funding. 1.2 million of that is for the Wallowa River Fish Passage at Green Valley Diversion Dam, Consolidated Diversion Dam, and at Wallowa Lake Dam as well. And then about 2.8 million in regional support for 4 projects in the Salmon Superhighway for design, implementation, and a couple of other culvert construction projects in the state as well. So it's been a long process since November, but we've identified a lot of opportunities in Oregon, and we're going to continue to work with our federal partners as well.
Thanks, Craig. And just to close out, we've developed a website on our department website that kind of highlights all of this information you've just heard, and attempts to connect the dots for folks so that we can really be that matchmaker here. We're seeing a lot of traffic to that site already, which is really encouraging. And just on folks like Craig and Alan and Greg, we're really going to try and protect their time over the next 5 years because we cannot afford to get distracted if we're going to take advantage of those funds. I think we'll...
Yeah, I was just going to, as we're closing this out, if you don't mind, Sean, I was going to jump in and just give a shout out to Andrea Hansen, who has really kind of just stepped into her new rotation in the director's office and is helping to lead these efforts, just works to create that great website. And then Craig Smith for just many hours on Eastern time zone meetings that 5 a.m. to try to get a handle on where this money was going to start flowing. And then to all of our focal group team leads and others that have worked so quickly to try to position us and get our partners moving on these fronts. So thank you for letting us take a little bit of time on your workshop today to fill you in. But we feel like this is such a game changer for us on the fish passage front that we couldn't tell you the whole story without sharing what is such a focus for us right now.
If I could just respond to that real quickly, it's remarkable. I heard you say a couple of weeks ago, several of you, that we should listen to this and we should add this to the passage workshop. Remarkable job of applaud to you, or I applaud you for putting it on here. It was terrific. And I had no idea how much that was a good idea when you mentioned it. So thank you for adding that. Commissioners, questions, things that you want to get to in the last time that we have? Looks like Commissioner Spellbrink has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Wall. Yeah, Sean. Hey, I just quick on the Wallowa Lake thing. I know that there's that's kind of a famous kokanee fishery, you know, the Wallowa Lake, which is, of course, landlocked sockeye salmon. Is there any of the original genetics left in that, you think, or is that all, are the original genetics from that run that used to go up that country all gone?
I think we've got our local expert here, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Great question. The native genetics are extinct as well from Wallowa Lake, Commissioner Spellbrink. We've had several studies that happened, most recently a genetic study that places the extant stock now with two genetic sources. One was a hatchery stock from Kootenai Lake and Meadow Creek in British Columbia, and then the other from Lake Whatcom in Washington. But by all indications, the genetics, native genetics in Wallowa Lake have been extinct for several decades.
Yeah, I wondered about that. Thanks.
Sure thing.
Commissioner Labhart, and then I have a question as well. Go ahead, Commissioner Labhart.
Thank you. Just a comment. So, Greg, you've done your homework, because yesterday at the tour, there was a number of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff from Washington, D.C. that were there on the tour. And I can tell you, at least I think, I was very impressed with what Marcia Williams had to say, and she's the one that makes a final decision on the funding for the Salmon Superhighway. So you've done your homework, because they were very impressed. So I'm optimistic that we're going to get some significant funding for that project.
Yeah, Commissioner Labhart, I think, you know, things are just beginning, and we can't say enough about the work Craig has done to track those programs. Like understanding the federal programs and laws and that morass is just really difficult, and he's done a phenomenal job filling that gap for us.
Yay. The question I have is, we just heard this remarkable story from the Wallowa. Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde mentioned that in the Klamath, with its hundreds of miles of habitat, that took a pile of money from California and a special set of circumstances. And my question coming into this was, with the revisions that you're looking at and with the prioritization, could you just talk a little bit about how we think about these great big systems that have hundreds of miles of habitat? And is it almost a different beast, if you will? And are there things that we need to be thinking about so that we get a few of these, like you just described with the Wallowa?
Yeah, Chair Wall. Well, I think that the Klamath is unique in Oregon in terms of how much land has historically been locked off from anadromy. When we think about the rest of Oregon, you have some barriers, but they don't necessarily lock off as much of the basin. I mean, I can think of Willamette and the Rogue, where we are, inhibiting access to some key spring chinook, steelhead kind of habitat. In those locations, you know, it's typically the federal facilities that have been constructed that are blocking passage there, and we're working through biological opinions and those kind of avenues to try and provide passage solutions there. I'm sure you know what's going on in the Willamette.
Yes.
Elsewhere, it's largely on tributaries that you find a lot of these structures, and we kind of go tributary by tributary through this prioritization process to see where are the highest priorities for us, and put our emphasis there. So it does come down to that prioritization, and then can you generate enough capacity with these new programs or existing programs to get projects on the ground with willing landowners? So it's a real mix of approaches, and it's always unique depending on who the owners are and what levers we have to work with.
Thank you. That helps. It does seem like, as I've listened to you all describe these over the last few months, that there are different buckets. It's a different bucket for the federal systems than it is for some of these others, and the tributaries are different than the big ones. So I just, as we go through the prioritization and especially the revisions, to the extent that we could think about ways to jumpstart some of the big ones, it would be useful. Let's go to Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde and then Commissioner Zarnowitz.
I just love this approach, which is landscape scale, prioritizing on communities. I love to see the projects like Wallowa, where you have tribes, irrigation district, community, everyone working together for the long run. I know that that's what we've worked on in Klamath for a very long time, and we've got a ton more work to do. So I'm very thankful that ODF&W is, engaging there more. I have this little thought that more could perhaps happen even in the Deschutes Crooked River system at this kind of a scale with relationships and partnerships. But I really love this approach, and it kind of goes back to even our Beaver working group that we've been working on here for a long time, where we're looking at landscape scale restoration and people coming together to improve our watersheds. And I just think it all needs to tie together. And when we tie it together in ways that is not punitive to people, I can't even tell you how much of a difference it makes when we approach each other as a team to lift up these systems instead of approaching each other as villains. So I'm really happy that we're going down this road. And also the Rogue. I want to plug the Rogue system and all this Rogue South Coast stuff. We just got done going through the Rogue South Coast plan. Let's continue to build those systems up, and let's talk about it too. Let's talk about it with our stakeholders, because I think they need to hear what's going on. I don't know that they are absorbing this right now.
Yeah, I think, sorry, Sean.
Go for it.
We had a really detailed presentation on each of the focal groups this morning with our leadership team. And actually, most of the work is happening with our local kind of stakeholder groups right now. If you look in the Rogue or the coastal areas, Klamath is a little different, as you know. We're trying to kind of be a partner, but also let some of the conversations that are getting started play out and plug ourselves in there. But for these other areas, we have been actively teeing up our local folks on the effort.
And just to add on to what you were talking about, watershed scale restoration, what we talked about today was prioritization of passage, but that's just one component of the work that ODFW does. And so we have this whole aquatic habitat prioritization that's been going on for a couple of years, which is really meant to drive and align every program in ODFW in the same areas. And we're doing that at a fifth field huck scale. So it's pretty significant size. And so fish passage will be aligning those areas, the water quality and quantity program, forest health, pretty much everything we do will be saying, these are the areas we want every tool we have in the book to focus on going forward, and sharing that with our partners too. So I think it really is that focus that we tried to bring through the climate policy and saying, where do we want to put all our investments?
Thank you. Vice Chair Zarnowitz.
Yeah, and adding that in, Sean, is really great, because that's something that obviously has needed to be done for a long time. So it's great that the policy has I guess instigated that or allowed it to kind of blossom. And I'm real impressed with all the work that the department's doing on the various ways of getting money to be able to restore habitats and passage. We just had a contractor out here that moved dirt around, and he didn't do it because he's booked up through July. And so I'm just wondering, how are you going to be able to get even the $8 million spent this summer if you're using outside contractors, unless ODFW has the staff at the screen shops to do that?
Yeah, so when IAJA came on board, we looked at what are the barriers going to be to implementing this, and there's several. One is things like NEPA, the federal kind of permitting process. Another is just the capacity in watersheds. Do we have people that can do the outreach to landowners to develop projects and get them going? And then the third, which you pointed out, is people are super busy right now, and there's just not as many people, restoration practitioners out there as we can do with to implement this amount of money in this shorter time. We're not the only state dealing with that. We've had some conversations with U.S. Forest Service, NOAA, others about how do we address these bottlenecks. And that's something we're really going to push hard on in the next year, is trying to, one, build capacity in these watersheds, two, try and find creative ways to get that workforce going. And there was some funding for the Forest Service to create a kind of a conservation corps, which I think they'll hopefully be standing up. So yeah, it's a barrier that we're trying to address. Certainly is going to be challenging to put this amount of money on the ground in 5 years. And everyone's running up across the nation. And so I think there'll be further conversations with Congress about this, to be honest, because it's not just the environment, but industry as well is running into these problems.
Yeah, well, you have the $8 million from the state that you have to use this summer, so or mostly this summer. So that,
yeah, I think through Alan's wizardry, I think he's being able to find some projects that we can actually implement this summer, and we'll be able to defer some of the funding that we were going to use for those to provide flexibility in future. So I think we'll have some good solutions here. And I just wanted to say one other thing about funding, which I think we forgot to mention earlier. The Private Forest Accord, that dedicated, was it $15 million a year into the Oregon Conservation Rec Fund for use at mitigating the impacts of forestry on covered species. So a few uses of that are, again, for passage, for water restoration, all these kind of things we're talking about. So that's another source of funding that'll be available to the department for the next 50 years or so that we'll be putting on the ground.
Wow. Thank you again to Debbie and Sean for insisting that this be part of it. It was a great add to this. This whole Wallowa story was a great add to give us perspective, plus a terrific story. Let's go to Becky Hatfield-Hyde. You have a question?
Yeah, just a quick comment as you guys are thinking about a workforce. There's a couple models that I really love, which I like that idea of the CCC or whatever it's called, but there's also, Sean, like down in Southern Oregon, there's Lomacatski that has worked a lot with tribes, and all down the Klamath River, we have tribal people doing amazing work in terms of forest health. And I just think that when we look at all the restoration work that needs to be done, there's some capacity in place that's really been successful in the past that we could really maybe help support more of that. And I would love to see that. It would certainly be very good, I know, for the communities I live in, but I think it could help a lot of other communities as well. So
thanks. I think those are good ideas.
Thank you. Commissioner Labhart.
Just one more, Sean. I'm sure you're aware of this, but the Renewable for America's Wildlife Act is probably going to pass. At least the word on the street is it's getting close. That brings in, I think, about 25 million to the department. So get ready for that one too. So it's all good news.
Well, and that's we are gearing up. As you know, we have a team working internally on kind of thinking about the future and what our vision would be for those dollars. And we focused on the aquatic side of these infrastructure dollars today because it was fish passage, but we have two other focal areas that we are also working quickly to try to engage on. And there's state dollars associated with, as you know, Commissioner Labhart. So we didn't even mention wildlife crossings as one of our focal areas and spending out those dollars that just came through the state as well.
I have one more question, and it's one that we can answer later. As we're thinking about back to these big systems, if there are things in the especially in the new rules and revisions, if we should be thinking differently about any of the big systems or how to prioritize these things. I know in some cases we have talked about 2-to-1 mitigation. That doesn't seem to really fit in this context. But if there are, ways that we should think differently about net benefit or especially about these big systems, it would be useful to hear those and to hear also I think somebody mentioned, maybe it was Greg, gaps in the gaps that exist and might be in these new rules. So especially the big systems, it would be useful to hear more. And we don't need it now because we have another question or two, and then we're getting close to the end. Commissioner King.
Coming up.
I think can't hear you. Try again.
Yeah, there. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. My question is kind of more in general. With, I guess it would be kind of the rules of this infrastructure money. Of course, talk about fish and wildlife. That is what we are. But we need to talk about our own infrastructure, meaning, our condemned buildings, our buildings in tsunami zones, things like that. So is there any mention or is there any ways to get money for that? Or is any of that going to be earmarked for that? Those sorts of things. I just don't know enough about the details of the restrictions, if you will, on the money.
Yeah, I mean, that's a significant piece of the pie. And we did look at some areas that we would love to find federal funding to help with. And really, it's pretty restrictive. I mean, in our perfect world, not even just thinking about our own infrastructure, but we would love to see more of these dollars help us with our staffing capacity on projects to get good projects. And it's so restrictive. They really want to do shovel ready of a certain type. And so far, we haven't really found much that lends itself to our own infrastructure.
Since we are about out of time, if I could, on behalf of the commission, thank people for a remarkable workshop. These have been, the few workshops that we've had have always been more than I could have expected or asked going in, and this one is another one of them. So thank you to all of you. I know there wasn't a lot of time to put this together, but I can speak for myself that I feel much more ready to take on these issues and have these conversations over the next several months. So thank you. Any last comments? Thumbs up around, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I might just thank Mark for the quick text. I'd been an hour late instead of 5 minutes late if he wouldn't have texted me. You can guess what happened there.
All right, well, let's end on that note, and we will see you all tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock for the commission meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.